The House on Seabreeze Shore. Uplifting Women's Fiction. Five Island Cove, Book 5. Written by Jessie Newton. Narrated by Jill Smith. Chapter 1. Kelli Thompson looked at the house she'd owned for decades now, her heartbeat giving her an extra thump she didn't quite understand. She'd been coming here for a few months, and she'd brought Parker several times. "Thanks, Rich," she said to the rideshare driver. "Could you help me with the boxes in the back?"
"Of course,"
Rich said, grinning at her over the console.
"When are you going to move in, Miss Kelli?"
The older gentleman with rich, dark skin had a quick smile every time he saw Kelli. She'd gotten into his SUV many times for a ride from the ferry to this house, and they'd become friends over the past few months. "Soon," Kelli said, reaching to unbuckle her seatbelt. Getting items for the house from Diamond to Belle Island wasn't easy, and she'd left Parker with Jean Shields today to get some things done. The springtime ocean breeze met her as she got out of the car, and Kelli took a moment to breathe in the scent of flowers mixed with sea salt. She loved springtime in the cove, and it felt like it was coming early this year, as it wasn't even April yet. The sky held a shade of blue rarely seen by the human eye, and Kelli looked up into it and felt the magnificence of life pressing down on her. Gratitude for the life she now lived streamed through her, because a year ago, she hadn't even known how unhappy she was. She'd been through some trials in the past 12 months, that was for sure, and her mind flashed past Zach Watkins, Tiffany Mueller, her ex-husband, Julian, hard work in a moldy, greasy kitchen at the Cliffside Inn, a tsunami, getting up at 5:30 to go to work every day, and losing everything she owned to water damage. She'd also attended a court hearing to finalize her divorce, learned to let go of her tight grip on her son, and spent a lot of time with her mother and her boyfriend.
"Just in the garage, Miss Kelli?"
Rich asked, and Kelli snapped out of her memories. She had plenty of others, and in fact, this house was stuffed full of them. She wanted to make even more here with her son, and she once again had the thought that she had more to do before she could move into this house. And it wasn't moving in several small appliances, new bedding, and a box of cleaning supplies. That all needed to be done too, of course, and she shivered as the breeze turned into a wind. She stepped to the back of the SUV and picked up the new coffee maker, stacked a toaster on top of it, and then grabbed the basket where she'd put all the linens, as well as the new kitchen utensils. She was stocking the house one purchase at a time, using some money from every paycheck. The house had hardly any furniture, but those were bigger purchases Kelli hadn't been able to afford yet. She'd been saving a little bit from every check as well, and she had 4 big items on her list before she and Parker could move into this house on Seabreeze Shore. 2 beds, one for her and Parker, a couch, a dining room table, and chairs. If she could somehow get those pieces, she could envision herself living in this house. "Right there is fine," she said to Rich, and he set down the blender and the laundry basket filled with new sheets and pillows. "Thank you so much, Rich."
"You're welcome, Miss Kelli,"
he said.
"You text me when you're ready to go back. I'll come get you."
"Yes, sir." She put down her boxed appliances, too, and stepped into him to give him a hug. "You say hello to Miss Everly for me, okay?"
"Oh, that reminds me.
He stepped away and snapped his fingers.
She sent a buttermilk pie for you."
"She did?" Kelli turned as Rich hustled back to the SUV. "How did she know you'd see me today?"
"It's a weekend,"
he said as he opened the passenger door and bent inside the vehicle.
"I've had the pie since yesterday, but it'll still be good."
He lifted it from the glove box, and Kelli gaped at the personal-sized pie. He grinned as he handed it to her, and Kelli felt more love from him and his wife, a woman she had never met, than she had from anyone but her best friends. "Thank you." Her voice choked slightly, and Rich held her tightly.
"She loves to bake,"
he said, stepping back.
"So you're doing something good for her."
"I hope she feels better quickly," Kelli said, as Everly seemed to have a multitude of health problems Rich had told Kelli about over the months.
I'll tell her you said so,
Rich said.
I best be going. Lots of people coming to Belle today.
Yes, go. Kelli smiled at him as he got behind the wheel, and she stood in the carport until he left. She started hauling in the appliances and things she'd brought to the house that day, and nothing gave her greater joy than unpacking things she'd worked hard to afford. She put them in cabinets and closets that made sense to her, and Kelli enjoyed the progress she'd made over the weeks. The kitchen sat clean and ready for her to use. She'd bought curtains and hung them on the windows, one over the sink and a huge one that overlooked the small backyard. The old table and chairs sat pushed into the corner, and Kelli needed to get rid of them. She wasn't paying for any services here yet, though, so she couldn't just put it on the curb and have the garbage truck haul it away. The pantry held bottled water, fruit snacks for Parker, the popcorn she and AJ shared when they came to the house for their private chats, and a box of protein shakes. Kelli needed to start thinking about stocking the house with more to eat, as well as all the home goods people needed to live. Toilet paper, paper towels, washcloths, oven mitts. The list went on and on. Kelli had lost everything in the tsunami that had hit Five Island Cove just before Christmas, and she'd been renting a fully furnished twin home on Pearl Island since then. Everything she'd been able to replace, she'd brought here, like her own silverware, a few dishes, and now the linens and kitchen utensils. All in all, she wanted to be ready to move into this house by summertime, but she still wasn't sure she'd make it. She worked as a teacher's assistant at the junior high on Diamond Island, and she managed to pay her bills with that income. There wasn't much left over, and Julian had been sending her money for Parker before the divorce was final, and now that it was, she was receiving alimony too. The money she got from her ex-husband paid for all of Parker's school expenses, their groceries every month, and as she unboxed the toaster, she realized he'd paid for that too. "You're getting closer," she said to herself. After putting away all of the items she'd bought that weekend, she wandered from the back of the house to the front, where a large room spanned the width of the building. The front door sat squarely in the middle of the room, and a large staircase went up to the second floor directly across from the entrance. The hall beside the stairs led to the kitchen and dining room, which took up the back of the house. Her father had kept an office in the space to the right of the front door, and the family had enjoyed their movie nights and family meetings in the room to the left. All the bedrooms were upstairs, including the master suite, and Kelli turned to go that way. She'd shared a bedroom with her younger sister, Heather, while her older one, Sabrina, had always had her own room. Once Sabrina had graduated and left the Cove, Kelli and Heather had their own rooms. She'd always had to share a bathroom, and her parents were the type that didn't keep their bedroom door open. Kelli still hesitated before going into the master suite, as she was never allowed in there as a child. She wasn't sure why. She'd started Parker's life with him in a bassinet right beside her in the master suite she and Julian had shared once upon a time. When he couldn't sleep, she brought him into their bedroom. The door was hardly ever closed or locked, and Parker came into her bedroom at will, even now. Memories of the house flooded Kelli's mind as she stood in the large room that had once housed her mother and father's bed. She could see the hulking, dark wood dresser that had sat next to the door, and the lacy, cream-colored curtains her mom had put over the bay window that looked over the backyard. Kelli went to the window and looked out. The view of the yard, the cliffs, and the ocean beyond, the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen. She did love the cove, though she'd always been afraid of the water. She wasn't as much anymore, but a hint of trepidation still stole through her from time to time when she thought about swimming in the ocean or getting on a boat. She had to ride a ferry to work every weekday, and she'd had to do the same as a child and teenager growing up. Somehow, a ferry wasn't the same as any other boat, and especially if she stayed inside, she didn't worry about sinking. Her parents had forced her to join the seafaring girls, and Kelli hadn't been happy about it. She was now, though, and she thought about the women she loved so dearly. "You need to tell them all about this house," she said to her partial reflection in the glass. Only AJ knew she owned this house, and Kelli wasn't sure why she wanted to keep it a secret. "You need to tell your mother." She wasn't sure how her mom would take the news that Kelli had bought this house and had owned it all of these years. Her mother hadn't wanted it, not after everything that had happened here. The walls started to whisper, little hisses of sound in Kelli's ears. She turned quickly and left the master bedroom, skipped going into the one she'd once used, and hurried downstairs instead. She burst out the front door, as she'd done many times before, one instance of when she had fresh in her mind. When her father had lost the glassworks, it had felt like everything in Kelli's life stopped making sense. That was the beginning of the end for her family as she'd previously known it, and she remembered keenly listening to her parents argue in loud voices that only increased in volume. She remembered the feeling of unrest, the worry which writhed way down deep in her soul, and the fear that if her family fell apart, she'd crumble too. She remembered jumping to her feet and leaving Heather and Sabrina huddled together in the hallway outside their parents' bedroom and racing down those steps. 2 long strides, and she reached the door. A twist, a pull, and she burst onto the front porch. She stood there now, letting the fear and doubt and worry wash through her. Accepting how she felt was the only way she'd been able to rid herself of it. If she didn't allow herself to feel the feelings, they built up to dangerous amounts, infecting her thoughts and influencing her actions. She didn't want to live like that anymore. She wasn't afraid of what might happen anymore. She'd learned that she could take a situation and work through it. She could think, and she was smart enough to come up with solutions. She could help others because she wasn't drowning the way she'd once been. She drew in a deep breath and found her center. "You're okay," she said out loud. She had no idea how to start a conversation with her mom about this house, and she hoped all the progress they'd made over the past year wouldn't be undone when Kelli finally confessed she owned the house on Seabreeze Shore. Her friends could help her, and she took out her phone to send a few texts. Number 1, she needed to get this Wednesday off of work. Her friends met for lunch every Wednesday. Kelli could never go, and she tried not to let it bother her. In her quiet moments, though, it definitely bothered her that everyone had a job that allowed them the freedom and flexibility to lunch together every week. Kelli didn't have that luxury, and her ideas of starting a yoga studio in the right part of the house where her father had once kept his office entered her mind again. That would have to wait, though, as she needed money for furniture, food, and the necessities of life before she could even think about starting her own business. A business that may fail. Kelli was still mighty afraid of failing. Failing herself, her son, her friends. Her principal said, "I'll call Miriam, and if she can come in on Wednesday, you can have it off." "Thanks," Kelli typed out. Before she got confirmation from her boss, Kelli sent a message to the group string that housed Alice, Robin, AJ, Eloise, Kristen, and Laurel. "I have something to tell everyone on Wednesday for lunch. Will everyone be there?" They'd talked about getting together for Sunday dinners, but it had only happened a couple of times. Alice and Robin loved to entertain, and without them, the dinners probably wouldn't have happened at all. Messages started to pour in, and before another 60 seconds had passed, everyone had confirmed that they'd be there on Wednesday, even Laurel. Kelli's lungs tightened, but she pushed through the pressure on her chest. This was okay. She could tell her friends about the house, and when she asked for their help with how to break the news to her mother, they'd all have solutions and suggestions she hadn't thought of. That honestly wouldn't be that hard, because every time Kelli thought about telling her mother about this house, she pushed the idea away. She didn't even entertain it, and keeping the house on Seabreeze Shore a secret was second nature to her now. She took another breath and released the tight grip her fingers had on the railing. She looked down at her fingers as the tension released, a plan coming together. Kelli loved plans, and once she had one, she could execute it. Her friends would help her come up with a plan to tell her mother about this house. Kelli? She looked up from where she'd been staring at the porch railing, her pulse pounding at the familiar voice. Her mother stood just on the other side of the white picket fence separating the front lawn from the street, pure confusion on her face. "What are you doing here?" Chapter 2. A.J. Proctor finished her third freelance article for the week and sent it to her 4 biggest contacts. They all knew to check their emails on Sunday evenings because A.J. tended to work in spurts, and she liked taking the beginning of the week off from researching, interviewing, and writing as she negotiated contracts and sniffed out new stories. She worked a lot from Wednesday to Sunday, and she put the finishing touches on her articles so they'd land in inboxes first thing on Monday morning. Some people over the months had learned to check their messages on Sunday evening, and she'd gotten exclusive contracts offered before the new week started from big papers out of New York and LA, Miami and Dallas, and she'd just submitted a story that would blow away the baseball world once it went to press.
Done?
Matthew Hymas asked as he came into the little office they shared. He pressed a kiss to AJ's neck, and she grinned in his direction. "Just finished," she said. He moved away from her and sat at his desk with a groan.
Sounds good.
He barely looked at her as he woke his laptop.
My dad wants me at the course by 6 because Greg Sherman is going to be there for a press release at 7.
Oh, right. AJ leaned back in her chair, grateful for her fiancé for making room for her in his life. He'd moved in the desk where she worked, and he'd been sharing his bed with her since a week or 2 before Christmas. Matt shared his family with her, and he came along with her to spend time with her friends. She still hadn't met his children, as none of them had come to the Cove in the past 3 months. A blip of anxiety moved through her, but AJ had tactics to tame it before it grew into full-blown panic. She'd been seeing a counselor here in Five Island Cove every week since the new year had begun, because she couldn't be on her antidepressants and anti-anxiety medication during her pregnancy. She put her palm against her belly, trying to feel the life within her. She'd been told at her last doctor's appointment that she should start to feel the baby move at any point now, but she still hadn't felt anything except sharp disappointment. In the beginning, Matt had asked her questions about her health every day. He doted on her constantly, and he was so good and so kind to her. He still was, but now that the morning sickness had ebbed away, all that was happening to AJ was an increasing midsection. She definitely had a little baby bump now, but she didn't have to leave the house for anything she didn't want to, and she had covered up her pregnancy with sweaters and bulky winter jackets for the past few months. Matt still hadn't told his parents about AJ's pregnancy, and she knew he hadn't told his kids. He hadn't been divorced for a year yet. That anniversary wouldn't happen until July. Their baby was due in August, and AJ had been trying to see things from his perspective. She tried not to worry about what his silence might mean or not mean, but she wondered what his endgame was. Their wedding was slated for May 28th, and AJ clicked to open the calendar on her laptop to see they were exactly 68 days away. "Are your children coming to the wedding?" AJ asked. The only time she ever brought up his kids first was when speaking about the wedding.
Justin is,
Matt said.
He'll be here in 3 weeks, remember?
Yes, AJ said. His youngest son was finishing his first year at NYU, and he'd asked if he could come live in Five Island Cove with Matt. He'd taken a job at the family golf course in order to save money for his sophomore year of studying civil engineering. I'll have the room ready for him.
It's ready already, sweets,
Matt said, wearing a smile in his tone. AJ turned her chair to look at him, and she found that handsome smile on his face. He kept his beard neat and trimmed, and when he'd asked her if he should dye his hair to keep the gray away, she'd steadfastly protested. She loved the silver in his beard and sideburns, and she got up to kiss him. He said, grinning to break the kiss. Have you told Derek or Lisa? AJ asked, settling herself on his lap, though he clearly had work to do for tomorrow's press conference at the golf course. Gregory Sherman was running for mayor of the Cove this year, and AJ didn't doubt for a moment that he'd win. His son was the chief of police, and everyone on all 5 islands loved Aaron Sherman. He was marrying one of AJ's best friends in only a few weeks, and the Cove Chronicles had called it the wedding of the year. Robin had been thrilled, of course, as she'd been working on Eloise and Aaron's wedding for the past 8 months. Eloise had finally embraced having the wedding of her dreams, and AJ couldn't wait to see it. She and Matt had been planning something similar, and with Robin's help, AJ was sure she'd get the wedding she'd always wanted, too.
I'm going to tell them about it this week,
Matt said. AJ's eyebrows went up. He'd never committed to a time frame before. He'd always said, I'll tell them soon, AJ, or I'm just waiting for the right time, Ava. He'd never said, try to understand, Ava Jane, but that was the message she'd gotten. She had been trying. This week? She asked.
Yes.
He finally looked away from his computer and wrapped his arms around her. She directed one of his hands to her belly, and he grinned as he put his palm against their baby. He hadn't wanted another baby. He'd told her that in precise words. They'd used protection when they'd been intimate, even though AJ believed herself to be past the age where she could successfully carry a baby. Yet AJ had missed her period, taken a test, and found herself pregnant, all within 4 months of reconnecting with Matt. She knew it was fast and unexpected. She had no idea how she'd feel if her ex-husband got himself a new wife and a new baby only a year after his divorce was final. And she had no idea how she'd have reacted if her father had met and married another woman at the same time she'd moved out to go to college.
Lisa wants to come to the Cove for her summer vacation before she starts medical school, and she needs to know what she's going to find here.
AJ bit back the question that popped into her mind. Would he tell his daughter if she wasn't planning to come to the Cove this summer? She hated the poisonous thoughts, but she didn't want to be naive either. She'd spent plenty of years with men unwilling to commit to her, and she couldn't stand the thought of Matt being one of them. Perhaps it was time to say something. Be brave, she told herself. She didn't want to raise a baby alone, not at her age. At the same time, she absolutely would not marry a man who didn't want to marry her, who was embarrassed to be with her, or who couldn't tell his family about her and his life with her. Maddie, she said, covering his hand on her belly with both of hers. Be honest with me. Just be honest. I feel like you're hiding me and our baby from your family. She'd told him several times since Christmas that she wanted to talk to his parents, and he'd put her off. I want to talk to your parents about us and our baby. I want them to know they're going to be grandparents again. I want your children to know they're going to have a half-brother or sister. She stopped because her heartbeat reverberated in her own ears and made her chest vibrate in a strange way. I don't care if you tell Melanie or not, because she doesn't really have to be part of our lives. But your kids do, and your parents are. Matt didn't say anything for a few seconds.
I might have been hiding you and the baby from my family,
he finally admitted.
I'm sorry, Ava Jane. I'm not embarrassed about it.
They're going to know, she said. The baby is due August 11th, Matt. They can do math. They'll know we've been sleeping together since November. Sooner than that, but that was one thing they didn't have to disclose.
I know,
he said.
You're right. I know you're right. I have this mental block I can't seem to get past.
Do you really think Justin hasn't told his siblings?
I asked him not to,
Matt said, practically under his breath.
I shouldn't have done that.
AJ cinched her bravery tight because she didn't want any secrets between her and Matt. If you don't want to be with me, it's really okay.
Don't even say that,
he said instantly.
It's not true, Ava Jane. I've wanted to be with you since I met you way back in high school.
He told her that several times, but she needed his actions to start to match up with his words. I need you to tell your family, she said.
I know you do.
He shifted, and AJ stood up.
Let's call my parents right now.
Really?
Yes.
Matt stood too and took her into his arms.
I love you, Ava Jane. Please do not doubt that for even a moment.
You didn't want another baby, she whispered, watching him for his reaction.
A baby is a blessing,
he said, his dark eyes serious and genuine.
Especially for you, and I'm thrilled you get to have the things you've wanted for so long. I'm just worried about raising another child. I'm old, AJ.
He grinned at her, and AJ couldn't help smiling back up at him. So am I, she said. We can do it. Together, Maddie. We can do anything together.
We sure can.
He kissed her temple and reached for his phone.
Let's get them both on the speaker.
He tapped, and a moment later, the line started to ring.
Matthew,
his father said, as he always used Matt's full name.
Can you get Mom?
Matt asked.
I need to tell you both something. Sure,
Yancey Hymas said.
Give me a minute. She went into the storage room to find some chocolate chips.
Barbie Hymas made cookies as easily as breathing, and AJ wasn't surprised to hear she'd gone to find an ingredient to satisfy her husband's sweet tooth. The time passed between her and Matt in silence, and then his dad said,
We're both here, Matthew. We're both here, too,
Matt said.
Ava Jane and I. Mom, Dad, we're going to have a baby.
Oh, my goodness, Barbie said, her voice mostly made of shock. Matt cleared his throat, his gaze seeking and finding AJ's. She reached out and cradled his face, a physical reminder that they could do anything together.
The baby is due in August, and we're getting married at the end of May. We want you there for all of it.
Of course we'll be there for all of it, Barbie said. Congratulations, you two. His father said nothing, AJ noted, but his mother carried the conversation with her excitement, and the call ended when Matt promised his father he'd be at the golf course on time in the morning. AJ released the breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding in the bottom half of her lungs. Thank you, Matt.
We're not done yet,
he said, still tapping on his phone.
Let's call Derek first. Once Lisa knows, she'll want to call the boys and talk it all through.
He smiled at AJ, and she marveled that he didn't harbor any apprehension in his expression. She only knew he was nervous about telling his kids about his new relationship and the new baby because he'd told her he was. They made the call to Derek, who said he suspected something because Matt had been posting pictures of him and AJ on social media. He didn't seem terribly upset, and he said he'd come to the Cove for the wedding in May.
One left,
Matt said with a sigh. AJ gave him a smile because she knew this wasn't easy for him. It wasn't easy for her either, and meeting his children would be worse. She'd only meet Justin before the actual wedding as things stood right now, and she wondered if she should suggest she and Matt go visit his other children where they lived so she could at least meet them once before she married their dad. Hey, Dad, Lisa said, and AJ hadn't even realized he'd dialed. What's up?
Lisa,
Matt said.
I have Ava Jane Proctor on speaker with me.
Ava Jane Proctor? Lisa asked.
She's my girlfriend,
Matt said as he sat down in his desk chair.
Wow, there's so much to tell. She's not just my girlfriend, Lise. She's my fiancé. And we're going to be married at the end of May. I'm not sure what your schedule is like, but we'd love to have you there.
He looked up at AJ, who nodded. Hello, Lisa, AJ said. It's AJ. I'd love to include you in whatever you're comfortable doing for the wedding. Bridesmaid or something. His daughter said nothing, and she must have gotten that trait from her grandfather. Matt just held up his palm, and AJ remembered that he'd told her once that Lisa needed a few minutes to absorb information. AJ's pulse ricocheted through her body because he hadn't even mentioned the baby yet. By the end of May, she wouldn't be able to hide the pregnancy, and she didn't want to. If she'd wanted to marry Matt in a skinny dress, she'd have done it months ago. Wow, Dad, Lisa finally said. Okay, yeah. When? What day in May? The 28th, AJ said. It's a Sunday. Just a sec, Lisa said. Yes, I can be there by then. She cleared her throat. I'd like to be in the wedding, AJ. Thank you for offering. Warmth filled AJ, and she beamed at Matt's phone. Of course, she said. I'm glad you want to participate. I can start to send you details if you'd like. Sure. They exchanged numbers and email addresses, and AJ climbed back into Matt's lap while he chatted with his daughter about her upcoming finals and her plans for moving to Colorado for veterinary school. He then surprised AJ with the words,
AJ and I will be in Maryland for your graduation, Lise. Love you, baby.
I love you too, Dad, his daughter said. And the call ended. He sighed and pressed his face to AJ's chest.
You'll go to Maryland with me, right, Ava Jane?
Of course, she said, still somewhat surprised. I didn't realize you were going.
I'm going,
he said.
She's my oldest and my only daughter. She's been at Johns Hopkins for 4 years on a scholarship.
He wore the pride right in his eyes.
Of course I'm going.
Then I'll go too, she said. Her stomach clenched, and AJ winced slightly. She was used to having different aches and pains in her abdomen since she'd learned she was pregnant, but this felt different. She let out a cry and put her hand on her stomach.
Hey, what's wrong?
Matt asked, covering her hand with his.
Are you okay?
Concern filled his voice and face, and AJ wanted to tell him she was fine. But pain ripped through her core, moving from front to back, and all she could do was suck in a breath and then let out a scream. The piercing pain sliced through her with white-hot precision she didn't understand, and all AJ could think was, please don't let me lose the baby now. Not after Matt had just called his parents and told them. Not after he'd called his children and told them about her and the wedding. He hadn't mentioned the baby, but now that his parents knew, the word would spread quickly. Matt, she whimpered as the pain subsided. There's something wrong.
Let's go to the ER,
he said, moving so that AJ had to stand up from his lap. She couldn't quite feel her legs, though, and she leaned heavily against the desk in front of her. I can't move, she said, fear taking over in such a way that AJ couldn't name where she was or what was happening.
Then I'll carry you.
Matt scooped her into his arms, and AJ wrapped her hands around his neck as she started to cry. Hurry, Maddie, she said as he hustled toward the front door. He set her delicately in the front seat of his SUV, and AJ's fingers trembled as she pulled her phone from her pocket. She needed all the help she could get, and she put her sister and Robin in a text together before sending a message to both of them. On my way to the hospital, having pain in my abdomen. Tell everyone to pray. Tears streamed down her face as Matt got behind the wheel. She tapped to send the text, and then she dropped her phone as another wave of agony threatened to rip her apart cell by individual cell. Chapter 3. Kelli nearly stumbled down the front steps, her heartbeat rebounding through her whole body. "Mom," she said, noting the little dog on a leash she hadn't seen before. "When did you get a dog?" "Are you moving in here?" Paula Watkins, her mother, wasn't going to let this go. Kelli needed to simply come clean. It was time, for everyone. Kelli reached the waist-high fence as the clouds overhead shifted. She felt like the world around her was as easily pushed this way and that as the clouds by the atmospheric winds. The sunlight appeared, bathing both women and the little dog in warmth and golden rays. She took a deep breath and glanced down at the dog. The brown and black creature sat and waited, as if Kelli's mom had spent long hours training it. "Yes," Kelli said, finally looking up into her mother's face. She saw her own eyes looking back at her. Dark hazel that could look green with the right blouse, or browner when wearing taupes, whites, and blacks. Kelli's mother's eyebrows dragged down in the middle, clear confusion coming from those eyes. Her face held a hearty sprinkle of freckles, as did Kelli's. Hers ran over her shoulders and down her back, too, especially if she laid out in the sun for longer than 15 minutes. "I don't understand," her mother said. "I bought the house when it came up for sale," Kelli said. "Years ago." Her mother's eyes widened with each word. "Why?" "I wanted it," Kelli said, turning back to the house. Since the collapse of her life in the past 12 months, one of the only things that had comforted her was the fact that she owned this house. She'd lost so many worldly things in the tsunami that had drowned the island over Christmas, but she still had the house. She could sell it and have a good start on a new life. "I'm fixing it up," Kelli went on. "A little bit here and a little bit there. I come on the weekends and bring the things I've managed to buy. Parker and I are going to move in here before school starts in the fall." Kelli had never spoken those words out loud before, but as she did, her determination to make them true bloomed. 5 months. She could save up enough to get the basics if she counted every penny, and she would do exactly that. "I can't believe it," her mother said. "It wasn't on the market long, and I assumed a corporation or something had bought it, but nothing was ever done with it." Kelli swallowed, because she didn't know what to say. Did you ever want to buy it back?" "No." Her mom shook her head decidedly. "No, I don't want to live here again." She peered up to the front door. "I don't even know if I could step inside." "You don't have to," Kelli said. "I'm fine bringing Parker to you at your house, with Devin." "Where's Parker?" her mom asked. "Jean's got him today," Kelli said with a smile. "She loves him, and I think he helps her feel less lonely." Her mom smiled and looked down at the puppy. "I'm glad he has her." She looked up again. "You know you can always ask me or Devin to help." "I do, Mom." Kelli crouched down and patted the dog. "What breed is she?" "She's a Yorkie," Mom said. "I just got her a few days ago from Marjorie Carroll. You remember her? She used to live up the road here, but she moved in with her daughter a couple of years ago." "My goodness," Kelli said, straightening. "Marjorie Carroll? She was old when I was a teenager." She grinned at her mother. "So she was rehoming the dog?" "Yeah," Mom said. "I visit her every so often, as Regina lives near the house. Last time I went, Margie asked if I might know anyone who would take little Tina. I said I would, and Regina brought her over earlier this week." She smiled down at the dog. "She's making a good transition." "How old is she?" "She's almost 4, her mom said.
I like having her. She's good company.
I bet she is, Kelli said. What does Devin think? The conversation was going fairly well, considering Kelli rarely knew what to say to her mother. So much had changed in the past year, and she wanted her relationship with her mother to continue to improve.
Devin likes her,
Mom said with another smile.
Will you be on the island tonight? You should come to dinner at the house.
Her eyes flitted toward the front of the house where Kelli had grown up.
The stained glass windows are still in good shape. They cleaned right up,
Kelli said. I'm hoping to perhaps open a yoga studio in the half of the house where Dad used to have his office. She nearly choked on the word Dad, but it still pushed out of her mouth. She watched her mother for any reaction, but she gave none but a nod. The breeze picked up, and Kelli realized she'd left her jacket inside. I can't come to dinner tonight, she said. Jean has a library board meeting, and I promised I'd be back by 6. She pulled her phone out of her pocket. I should finish up here and get on the 5:10 ferry. Her mother nodded.
Tomorrow, then. I'd love to know more about the house.
It's really okay if you don't, Kelli said. I understand. To me, Mom, this house meant something. I couldn't imagine someone else living here. My memories of this place were good, right up until the day we left. They hadn't left willingly either. Kelli knew that. She knew Mom hadn't been able to pay the mortgage and the bank had evicted them. Life had not been good after that, though Kelli knew now that her mother had done her very best to protect Kelli and her sisters from the hard things of the world. Mom, Kelli said, I know you did everything you could, and I appreciate it. Mom looked away, but Kelli saw the tremble in her chin. She said nothing, and that was because if she did, she'd give away the emotion storming through her. I love you, Kelli said. I don't want this to hurt you.
I want you to be happy,
her mother said, her voice very tight.
I know you love this house, and I'm glad you bought it. You'll make it the perfect place to raise Parker.
She smiled, her eyes flitting past Kelli and back to the stained glass windows. Kelli didn't know what else to say, so she simply took another couple of steps and embraced her mother. I love you, Kel, her mom said, and Kelli returned the sentiment. She watched her mom continue down the road, the little Yorkie trotting along beside her, feeling like she'd just conquered the world. A couple of hours later, Kelli boarded the ferry. The sun had started its final descent into the western ocean that separated Five Island Cove from the mainland U.S. It was really only about 50 miles, but it felt like the chain of 5 tiny islands sat out in the middle of only water. Water in every direction. Water and more water. Kelli disliked water. She wasn't a fan of boats, and she always sat inside on the ferry if she could. Tonight she could, and she took a seat on the end of a row where a gentleman had sat right in the middle. He had his head turned toward the windows, and when Kelli sat, he didn't look at her. Kelli was used to men paying her little attention. She wasn't like AJ in any way, and she'd been overlooked so often that she'd jumped at the chance to get married from the first man who'd paid her any iota of attention. Julian's face ran through her mind, and she let it. She had loved him unconditionally, and the marriage to her was everything she'd wanted. She would have liked more children, but it had taken her a long time to conceive Parker. They'd only gotten the one son, and Kelli had barely let him leave her sight for much of the first 8 years of his life. That was one good thing that had come from her visit to Five Island Cove. She was only supposed to come for a couple of days for Joel Shields' funeral, but everything had changed so much as they'd cleaned out the man's office and found so many secrets. Kelli smiled as she thought of her friends, and she looked at her phone again, seeing all of them agree to lunch on Wednesday.
Kelli?
She turned to her right, toward the man sitting 2 seats over from her. My goodness, she said, smiling. Shad. Shad Webb lived right next door to her on Pearl Island. They shared a wall in the twin home, and she'd often run into him as he left for work at the same time she did. She'd spent most of their brief morning exchanges apologizing for any noise Parker may have made playing his video games, the recorder his teacher required, or for setting off the smoke alarm when she'd tried to teach Parker how to make pancakes.
You're heading to Diamond?
He asked. Yes, she said, folding her hands over her purse in her lap. She carried the buttermilk pie with her, as Jean would love it. My son is staying with someone there. I'm going to get him and head back to Pearl. Shad nodded, his dark eyes sparkling with plenty of secrets. Kelli would almost call it mischief if the man had been in his 30s. He wasn't. Shad was probably a decade older than her, but he still had a full head of hair, and it looked like someone had taken a white crayon, a black one, and a gray one, and held them in one hand while they colored his hair. He was clean-shaven, with a square jaw and white teeth. He did something with finances for the town of Five Island Cove, and he'd been a lifelong resident of the cove. He had no children, though he'd been married before.
Not for a while,
he told her when they'd talked about their significant others. That had been a quick conversation, as most of theirs had been.
Do you have time for dinner?
Shad asked, and Kelly's gaze jerked to his. He was tall, tan, and trim, and she could only imagine what he'd look like on the beach in a pair of swim trunks, or at dinner, for that matter. She looked down at his shirt, which was a polo in a mixture of red and blue stripes. He wore black jeans with it, and somehow Kelli had never seen a sexier pair of pants. Dinner? She asked. Me, you, and Parker? Shad got up and moved over a chair so that he sat right next to her.
I was thinking just me and you, actually.
He gave her one of those blinding white smiles.
I've been trying to come up with a way to ask you out for 3 months now.
Kelli's eyebrows went up. The only thing her mind could comprehend was 3 months? Shad kept the grin on his face. He nodded, a slight chuckle coming from his mouth. He lifted one shoulder in a shrug as if to say,
What can I say? You're the most beautiful creature I've ever met, and I want to take you to the nicest restaurant in Five Island Cove.
He probably wasn't saying all of those things, but Kelli hadn't had a man's interest in a very long time, and she had a very good imagination. She checked her phone, and she'd made it onto the 4:40 ferry. They'd arrive on Diamond by 5:15. Okay, she said, but I have to pick up Parker at the lighthouse by 6. He looked at his wristwatch, which also gave away his age.
I think we can make that work.
Chapter 4. Robin Grover approached the lifeguard station on her favorite stretch of beach, her breath burning through her chest. She'd taken up her running regimen again in the past week, and while she'd acclimated to getting up earlier, her physical body was still trying to figure out how to breathe and move so fast without dying. Her steps slowed, and she went up off the harder-packed sand and around the wooden structure, her feet squishing through the softer sand up here. It wasn't beach weather yet, but soon enough, this west-facing island beach would be covered with tourists. Robin would run in the early morning hours, just as she was now, so she wouldn't have to worry about dodging the crowds. Robin jogged at a slower pace back to where she'd parked, and she took several long minutes to stretch through her calves and back. She was getting closer to 50, and she couldn't afford to pull a hamstring or overextend a knee. She finally got behind the wheel of her minivan and made the drive back to her house, which sat nearly in the middle of Diamond Island. Duke's truck wasn't in the garage, which meant he'd already left for the dock. She thought of the new fishing boat he'd been using for the past few months since the tsunami. It felt like years since December, while at the same time, the memories were so strong, Robin would have sworn she'd just survived the storm yesterday. Their new boat had been delivered by mid-January, and Duke had been out on the water every day since. He and his friend Brian were going to Alaska again this summer, and as Robin now had a pretty substantial boat payment to make each month, she couldn't argue with the money. She sighed as she got out of her nearly broken-down van, the constant thought of money on her mind. She hated that, as she felt like a couple of her and Duke's age should be buying Buicks or Cadillacs as their children became adults and they had more money to spend. If anything, Robin had less, and she reminded herself that Mandy still had 2.5 years of high school left. She didn't have any children out of the house yet, and activities and teenage years cost a lot of money. Life happened, and Robin didn't want to deal with it alone. She paused on the front sidewalk and sent her husband a text, noting that she had 4 or 5 others she hadn't looked at yet. She often put her phone on silent early on Sundays, as she and Duke lounged in bed starting about dusk. She'd gotten up, dressed, and shoved her phone in her pocket before leaving the house, only to have it just in case she encountered a problem. Robin knew if she looked at her phone before her run, she wouldn't go. She'd just check that email real quick, or hurry and respond to a client. It'll only take a sec. Before she knew it, the morning would be half over, and she wouldn't even know if or when Mandy and Jamie had left for school. Love you, babe. Be safe and hurry home tonight. I'm going to make that sausage pizza. She sent the message to Duke and navigated back to her home screen. A couple of texts from clients sat at the top, and she quickly answered their questions, both of which had come in last night. Robin cursed herself for not checking her device before going to bed. She shouldn't have to be on call 24 hours a day, but in the world in which they lived, almost everyone was. People expected their messages to be answered in a timely manner, too, especially if they were paying her a lot of money to plan their weddings. Robin had picked up as many jobs this spring and summer as she could. She could still have her Wednesday lunches with her friends and plan anniversary parties, high school graduations, and as many weddings as she could handle. She currently had more clients than slots, something that had never happened before. Of course, she'd never been the wedding planner for the wedding of the year, and Eloise had really helped Robin's business by allowing her to plan her nuptials with the chief of police, Aaron Sherman. The article in the Cove Chronicles had certainly helped too. Robin smiled at the message from Eloise, who'd said, 27 days, Robin. What can I help you with today? Robin would meet Eloise at 1:30 for a final fitting on her wedding dress. That would give the seamstress enough time to make any last alterations and give Eloise one more chance to try on the dress before the big day. As Robin started to remind Eloise of the dress fitting at the bridal shop that afternoon, her friend sent another text. Aaron wants you and Duke and the girls to come for dinner this weekend. Friday or Saturday? Robin's grin widened because she loved having other couples to go out with. She and Duke hadn't had a friend couple like that in a while, and Robin sure did like Eloise and Aaron. Not only were they fine people by themselves, but they were adorable as a couple. He paid real attention to her, and Eloise deserved nothing less. Not only that, but Billy and Grace absolutely adored Eloise, and she them. They'd been riding the ferry from Diamond to Sanctuary after school since January, where Eloise would pick them up and take them up to the Cliffside Inn with her. She ran the inn full-time and lived in a tiny house she'd parked at her mother's just down the hill from the inn. Her full-time chef lived in the small, one-bedroom apartment attached to the inn, and Rhonda also acted as the emergency manager whenever Eloise wasn't on site. She worked hard to leave the inn by 6 p.m., and she spent most evenings with Aaron and the girls at his house on Diamond. She'd move in there with them once she and Aaron tied the knot, but their routine likely wouldn't change. Robin sent the message about the bridal shop and then added, "Yes to dinner. Let me talk to Duke and see what his weekend is like." He went fishing every day because, just like Robin had picked up every available job she could squeeze into her working hours, He knew keenly about the boat payment that came due on the 5th of every month. His income had gone up about 20%, but he was paying for it with punishing hours. She rarely saw him when it wasn't dark, though now that spring was almost upon Five Island Cove, the sun showed its face for far longer than it did in the winter. The last text Robin hadn't read yet had come from AJ, and it was another one from last night Robin hadn't seen. On my way to the hospital, having pain in my abdomen. Tell everyone to pray. Robin's chest tightened to the point where she couldn't breathe, and her fingers fumbled as she started sucking at the air. She dropped her phone, and the resulting crack of plastic against cement made tears spring to her eyes. She dove after the phone and grabbed it. A hairline crack spread across the screen, but she ignored it as she quickly tapped to call AJ. "Come on," she said. "Pick up, Ava Jane. Pick up." Chapter 5. "Right here is fine," Alice Kelton said, and the rideshare driver pulled over. She'd have to walk a block to the high school, but she should have known she couldn't come at this time in the morning. She'd left 10 minutes after her twins and called the rideshare so she wouldn't have to figure out where to park. She hadn't said anything to Charlie or Ginny about why she was going to the high school that morning, and she hitched her purse higher on her arm after paying for her ride from her new home right here on Diamond Island to the high school. Memories filled her mind as she finished the walk to the school, and the bell had already rung by the time she stepped foot on campus. She still knew exactly where her locker had been in each of the 4 years she'd attended school here, and she braced herself for the familiar scent of floor wax, sweat, and fruity air freshener that said she'd arrived at 5 Island Cove High. The main office sat immediately to her right, and her heels clicked against the worn tile as she went in that direction. She'd only taken one step through the doorway when her phone rang. Since phones rang all the time in the office, none of the secretaries bothered to look up. Alice fished her phone from her purse and saw Robin's name on the screen. Alice hesitated, but in the end, she swiped her best friend's call to the left and silenced her phone. Drawing in a cleansing breath, she lifted her eyes to the first desk. A blonde woman sat there, very busy with something very important on the desk in front of her. Alice approached the desk, gripping the straps on her purse looped over her forearm. She hesitated for a moment, expecting the woman to look up at her and ask what she needed. When she didn't, Alice said, "Good morning." That got the blonde to look up. "How can I help you?" "I have an appointment with Arthur Rice," she said, without looking at her phone to check the name. "Oh, you want to be in the counseling office," the blonde said. "Okay," Alice said, not quite sure where that was. Sure, she'd gone to this school, but she hadn't spent any time hanging out with counselors. "And that is," she prompted when the woman went back to her work. Frustration ran through her because she had plenty of work she needed to finish today, too. Since the tsunami, Alice had signed several more clients, and after about 9 months of running her own little law office out of her home, she was finally starting to see some good profit. She made enough to pay the mortgage on the 3-bedroom home she'd bought for her new life here in the Cove. She could pay all the bills with Frank's alimony, and she put all of his child support into an account for the twins. "Oh, across the hall," the blonde said, "several yards down." "Thank you." Alice turned and left the main office, automatically searching for the counseling office across the hall. She saw the sign sticking out from the brick wall, and since first period had already begun, Alice only had to dodge a handful of students. This office wasn't nearly as large or airy, and only one woman kept the gate here. She at least looked up. Her straight-cut bangs dyed an unnaturally dark black. Alice had never understood the Gothic look, and it sure did feel strange coming from the woman in the counseling office at the high school. "How can I help you?" she asked.
I have an appointment with Arthur Rice, she said again.
Sure, his office is down the left hall here.
She pointed with a Barbie doll hand, her fingers close together and her thumb practically glued to her palm.
Last one at the end.
I can just go back?
Sure, she said. I know he's in there. He just came out for coffee.
The woman gave Alice a wide, warm smile and went back to her computer. Alice faced the hall on the left-hand side of the office and stepped that way. Offices branched off both sides of the hallway, and Arthur Rice's had his name outside of it, just like the others. She went to the doorway and slowed, peering inside. Her movement caught the attention of the man at the desk, and he looked up. Alice's breath caught in her throat, but her hand had already started its upward movement to knock on the doorframe. She did that as the man rose to his feet. He was likely several years older than Alice, if the salty gray hair in his sideburns and creeping up into his dark hair was any indication. He had wise, dark brown eyes and a full beard.
"Good morning,"
he said, his voice rumbling through Alice's chest.
"You must be Alice Kelton."
Yes, she blurted out, swallowing immediately afterward. She couldn't believe she'd let a handsome man render her mute. She'd met plenty of good-looking men in her life, and she certainly wasn't going to start dating this one. She'd seen William Bridge for a couple of months, but her children really hadn't approved of the relationship. His daughter had not been popular with the twins, despite the fact that she'd gone to live with her mother in Hawaii. That hadn't lasted long, and the teen had returned to the cove a week after Valentine's Day. While Alice really liked Will, and the childhood romance they'd once had as teens had been growing and exciting to Alice as an adult, she'd ended things with Will only a week later. The past 5 weeks alone had taught her that she was indeed lonely, but she hadn't tried to find someone new to date. She'd been reading a lot of self-help books for single mothers, and she'd very nearly determined to devote her life to her children until they graduated from high school and left her home to make their own way in the world. However, Arthur Rice had just swung her in the completely opposite direction.
"Come in,"
he said with a smile. With a sweeping gesture, he indicated the 2 chairs in front of his desk. Alice gave him a smile too, and she stepped into the small space and took the outside chair. She settled her purse on the floor next to her feet and looked up as Arthur settled into his seat.
"Nice to meet you,"
he said, extending his hand across the desk. "And you," she said.
"I really enjoy meeting the parents of my students,"
he said with a genuine smile.
"We've exchanged a lot of emails, and this way you see me as a real person, and I see you as a real person."
He folded his hands and kept his smile in place. "I see," Alice said. "Your last email said something about Charlie's grade in chemistry?"
"Right."
Arthur seemed to startle a little, and then he bent to pull open a drawer. He took out a folder and opened it on the desk in front of him. He studied something inside and then looked up.
"Are you aware that Charlie got a perfect score on his organic chemistry test?"
He plucked something from the folder and slid it toward Alice. Her defenses nearly touched the upper atmosphere, and Alice didn't even look at the paper. "We've had a lot going on in our family," she said. "We moved from—" Her voice trailed off as her brain caught up with what the counselor had said. "Wait, what?" She reached for the paper at the same time Arthur started to chuckle.
"You thought Charlie was in trouble."
Alice peered at the paper, which bore a scrawled 100 at the top in blue pen. "Your email was very foreboding," she said, trying to read the first sentence and getting confused instantly.
"Charlie is a great student,"
Arthur said.
"I want him to join the academic Olympiad."
Alice's eyes flew to Arthur's, hers much wider than they'd been previously. Her pulse thumped haphazardly against her breastbone as she struggled to understand. "Academic Olympiad?" The very idea sounded ridiculous inside her head, and Alice actually bit back a laugh.
Our AP English teacher oversees the team, and we're particularly weak on science students this year,
He said, not a smile in sight. He took another paper from the folder.
So we started looking through our honors chemistry classes, and when I spoke with Mr. James, he immediately nominated Charlie, pulled a few samples of his work, and I emailed you.
Why you? Alice asked. And what is Academic Olympiad?
It's a school team that does academic competitions over the summer.
Alice scoffed then. The last half of it definitely a laugh. I don't think so. She shook her head. There is no way you'll get Charlie to do this. She picked up the chemistry test and looked at it again. He told me he'd done fine on this test.
He's the only one in the whole school who got every question right,
Arthur said.
We find that for students like Charlie, it really helps to have parental support at home once we approach him here at school.
Alice's eyebrows went up. Her phone rang again, and once again she found Robin's name on the screen. She hesitated once more, but in the end she swept the call away like she had last time. Alice hadn't told anyone about her meeting with the school counselor that morning because she had assumed the meeting would be bad news concerning Charlie and the classes he was failing. Guilt pulled through her that her first thoughts had been negative. If Arthur had emailed about Ginny, Alice would have assumed something different. She swallowed, but the motion was somewhat difficult, and she really needed something to drink. Does it require time after school? Alice asked.
Yes,
Arthur said.
Mondays and Wednesdays for an hour. Does Charlie have a job?
Yes, Alice said. He works at the elementary school as a janitor every day after school.
Oh, great,
Arthur said with a smile.
Those are such flexible jobs. He can easily go in an hour later.
He passed her another paper.
I'm going to give you this. It's the parental permission form we need for him to be on the team, and I'm going to have Soraya talk to him today.
Oh, okay, Alice said. Her phone rang again, and Robin really wanted to get in touch with her. I'm sorry. She lifted her device. My friend had called 3 times in 10 minutes.
Go ahead,
He said.
I just wanted to talk with you face to face about your son.
Alice had made the mistake of looking into Arthur's eyes, and the call from Robin once again went to voicemail, this time without her having to swipe at all. They both stood up in unison, and Alice noticed that he hadn't looked away from her either.
I'll email you to let you know when Soraya had spoken to him.
Who's Soraya? Alice asked, trying to get in control of her hormones. She was only acting crazed because she was so lonely, and she missed Will. None of her self-help books had helped her know how to deal with handsome, kind, employed men.
She's the Olympiad student captain,
He said.
Great girl, and she was excited by the idea of adding Charlie to the team.
Alice nodded, not sure what else to say. The moment turned awkward, and she realized she was staring at the man. Clearing her throat, she turned to leave the office.
Alice?
Arthur asked behind her. She went out into the hall because his office was far too intimate. After turning back, she asked, Yes?
I hope this isn't inappropriate, but I'm wondering what you're doing for dinner tonight.
He settled onto the side of his desk and folded his arms. In the white shirt and tie, along with the dark brown slacks, he looked every bit the working professional that Alice liked. Her eyebrows couldn't get any higher, and she honestly had no response for the man. Dinner? Came out of her mouth.
Maybe you're seeing someone,
He said, utterly at ease in his own office. Alice thought of Will. She'd been thinking of him a lot lately, and she didn't know what it meant. No, she said, I'm not. Before he could say anything else, her phone rang again. Robin again. I'm sorry, she said. I have to get this. She gave him a final nod, not sure if she was telling him yes to dinner or simply saying goodbye. Striding away, Alice had never felt more foolish. "Robin," she said, avoiding the secretary's eyes as she practically flew from the counseling office. "What's going on?" "It's about time you answered your phone," Robin sniped at her. "What in the world are you doing this morning?" Getting asked out by Charlie's counselor, Alice thought. "Nothing," she said. "Why have you called me so many times?" "It's AJ," Robin said. "She's in the hospital after some abdominal pain and light spotting. I'm heading over there right now, and I'm just letting everyone know." Alice's heart dropped to the soles of her shoes, and she couldn't remember how to walk anymore. She stopped right there in the middle of the hallway in the high school. "Is she okay?" "I was only able to talk to her for a few minutes," Robin said. "Matt wasn't there, as he had the big press release for Aaron's father at the golf course this morning. I'm 10 minutes out, and then I'll know more." "I'm on my way," Alice said, realizing she wasn't living out on Rocky Ridge anymore, and she was as close to the hospital as Robin. "Have you called everyone?" "Yes," Robin said. "You're the last." "I'll be there in a few minutes," Alice said, realizing she hadn't driven herself to the school and she needed her phone to call for a ride.
Chapter 6. Kristen Shields saw Alice exiting the room Robin had said AJ would be in, and as the other woman looked left and right, their eyes met.
"Kristen."
Alice sounded relieved to see her, and she looked like she hadn't been sleeping enough. Kristen certainly wasn't, as the anniversary of the death of her husband loomed on the calendar only 2 weeks in the future. She'd been contemplating taking another step to move past Joel, but she hadn't told anyone about her idea to leave the house up the sidewalk from the lighthouse and find somewhere else to live. She wouldn't go far, and of course she'd still go out to the lighthouse. Her son and daughter-in-law lived there, and Kristen needed the soothing influence of the ocean as she viewed it from the top balcony of the lighthouse. Now was not the time to bring it up either, but Kristen had been planning to tell everyone on Wednesday at their lunch. Kelli would be there, and that almost never happened, as she had a day job that didn't allow her to lunch with her friends whenever she wanted. Kristen reached Alice and drew her into a hug. "How is she?"
"She seems upbeat,"
Alice said, gripping Kristen tightly.
"How are you? What are you doing to stay busy this month?"
Alice stepped back, her dark eyes searching Kristen's.
"You can come to my house any time. I'll put you to work filing."
She grinned, and Kristen returned the smile. "I might actually take you up on that," Kristen said. She'd helped Alice organize her home office, where she ran her law practice. Now that she'd moved to Diamond Island, she had more clients than she could handle. People always said that location mattered for a business, and in Alice's case, that had never been truer. She handled divorces, custody cases, protective orders, and anything else under the umbrella of family law, and she was very good at her job. She was sympathetic and kind, as she'd definitely had some blows dealt to her in the past.
"I'm just heading out to get coffee,"
Alice said.
"Do you want any?"
"Is everyone here?" Kristen asked. She'd been in bed when Robin had called, and everything seemed to take her longer these days. Just putting on her shoes made her fingers tremble, and Kristen put her hands in her pockets to hide the slight tremor from Alice. "No, thank you," Kristen said. The caffeine only increased the trembling, and she didn't need the extra stimulant.
"I'll be back in a sec."
Alice left, and Kristen faced the closed hospital room door. She wanted to go inside because she loved her girls with a power like no other. A mother's love, though she had not given birth to any of the women behind the door. In some ways, she had seen them become reborn. She'd watched Alice crawl her way out of the ashes after her mother's death. She'd been at Kelli's side when her parents had divorced, when her father had lost the glassworks, when he'd died. She'd done the best she could with AJ as the girl slept around and then grew to realize how much more she was worth.
She'd watched with a huge smile on her face as Eloise had embraced her academic side and earned scholarships all over the eastern seaboard. She'd been the first to know about Robin's engagement to Duke, and the way she'd become a new person without the pressure from her mother's thumb. Kristen took a deep breath and walked toward the door. She knocked on it and opened the door a moment later. "Hello?" She scanned the room, finding AJ sitting up in bed, Robin standing at the bedside, Eloise sitting in the recliner with Grace on her lap, and Kelli looking out the window. She turned toward Kristen as they all did, and Kristen smiled at them. "My girls," she said, entering the room and closing the door behind her.
"I told you we'd need the room big enough for 4 visitors,"
Robin said, grinning as she stepped forward to greet Kristen with a hug.
"The nurse just left. They're getting the doctor to come check AJ. They might let her go home."
Kristen watched the fear roll across AJ's face when no one else did. Eloise had bumped Grace to her feet, and when Kristen released Robin, she took the blonde girl into her arms. "Is your daddy letting you miss school today?" she asked Grace. "She's my shadow today," Eloise said, smiling down at Grace, who was in 4th grade this year. "Aaron's going to come get her after he's done at the golf course." Kristen stepped over to Eloise, and they hugged too. "You need to come up to the inn," Eloise said. "I've got an on-site masseuse now, and you'd love her." "Oh, twist my arm," Kristen joked, and they laughed together. Kelli had left the window, and Kristen hugged her, sensing something had shifted within the woman. She'd texted yesterday afternoon about having something to tell everyone this week, and Kristen wished she could take the strawberry blonde out into the hall and ask her what the trouble was. Perhaps it wasn't a trouble at all, but Kristen had raised 2 children and worked with hundreds of girls through the Seafaring Girls program Five Island Cove had run for decades. She knew unrest when she felt it inside a person, and Kelli had something eating away at her. Kelli offered her a timid smile as she stepped back, folding her arms as she then looked at AJ. The gorgeous woman looked up at Kristen from the bed, and all Kristen could see was the scared 14-year-old who'd shown up on the doorstep one night long after the last ferry had left Diamond Island. "My dear," Kristen said kindly, just as she had then. She bent down and hugged AJ, the woman's long limbs winding around Kristen's neck and holding her tight. Her chest heaved, and a couple of sobs shook through her, and Kristen knew she was teetering on the edge of a breakdown. She couldn't take her antidepressants during her pregnancy, and her fiancé and the father of her baby wasn't here. "What am I going to do if they send me home?" she whispered. "That's easy, Ava Jane," Kristen whispered back. "I'll go with you and take care of you." She'd once told AJ that she was welcome at the lighthouse any time, any day, any hour. She'd assured her over and over that though her own mother had left, AJ could always count on Kristen to take care of her. This would be no different. Nothing had changed, at least for Kristen. "Could you?" AJ asked. "Of course, dear," Kristen said, pulling back and smiling. She looked around at everyone. "What did the doctor say? I haven't gotten a very good update."
"She said AJ needs to be on bed rest for at least the next 3 weeks,"
Robin said, her eyes turning sharp as a bird's. "They think I just had a little bleeding as the baby shifted. It was nothing," AJ said.
"It was not nothing,"
Robin argued back. "It was probably stress-related," Eloise said. "That's what Dr. East said." "And you're stressing me out," AJ said to Robin, glaring at her. Kristen was used to her girls bickering amongst one another. Robin and Alice were the worst offenders, but they loved each other so fiercely. They'd been right beside each other over the past year since Joel's death, and right there when Kristen needed them too.
This is more than stress,
Robin said.
You have to be careful, AJ. If a woman who's been to medical school for 9 years says you should be on bed rest for 3 weeks, you do it.
You're not Dr. Proctor, Kelli said from her position by the window. Please, AJ. I have work to do, AJ said. Matt's kids are coming. His parents. Robin met Kristen's eye as AJ's voice trailed off. I have nothing else to do, Kristen said. I can take you to my house, or I can come to yours. You and Matt are right here on Diamond. Things keep, Eloise said gently as she came to stand beside Kristen. You can work if Kristen brings you your laptop. You can entertain from the couch. She exchanged a glance with Robin, and then Kristen. Right?
Yes,
Robin said firmly.
I had to do a couple of weeks of bed rest with Mandy, and it's boring. But you'll have Kristen to talk to, and I'm sure there's so much you haven't binged on the streaming services. There's so many of them now, it wouldn't even be possible to keep up.
Kristen simply nodded, though every time she sat down in front of the TV, she couldn't find anything to watch she hadn't already seen. So it was definitely possible to keep up with the streaming services. She didn't say so, though, because she was very good at keeping things to herself that didn't need to be said. She'd learned that from Joel. There was no harm in letting him think he was right. She could simply get the remote control out from under his chair when he went to the bathroom. It never worked when she said she'd seen it on his armrest and it had probably fallen. The door opened, and Alice entered with a precariously balanced cup holder for 4 cups of coffee. She had 6 stuck in it, and Robin darted over to help her.
All right,
Alice said, half a sigh in her voice.
Here we go.
She passed out the coffee to everyone, but kept 1 cup back, and Kristen felt a bit awkward without something to hold and sip. She tucked her hands away so they couldn't be seen and pressed them into her thighs to get them to quiet. At 77, Kristen didn't want to think about conditions like Parkinson's or neurological issues. She knew she was closing in on 80, but she felt like she had plenty of life still to live. She'd read that shaky hands could come from panic, depression, anxiety, or post-traumatic stress syndrome. With Joel's death date approaching, Kristen swung from panic to depression in the space between seconds. She could see him plainly in bed, not moving, his eyes closed. She pressed her eyes closed, hoping to erase the images as Kelli started to say something. Thankfully, her sweet voice chased away the memories that seemed so fresh on Kristen's soul, and her eyes popped open when Kelli said, We went to dinner last night. Yes, AJ said, as if she'd suddenly become a cheerleader. Way to go, Kel. Kristen scanned the room to find shock on Robin's face, surprise resting in Alice's eyes, and wonder in the O shape of Eloise's mouth. What's his name? Kristen asked, because she'd heard enough to know Kelli had gone to dinner with a man last night. Shad Webb, Kelli said, her face growing pinker by the moment. He lives right next door to me and Parker. He's the other half of the twin home. She smiled at her hands, and then up at everyone. He said he's wanted to ask me out since I moved in.
Kelli?
Alice rushed at her and hugged her.
Tell us everything.
She stepped back and took the recliner. Grace climbed right up onto her lap like she was Eloise, and Kristen loved that the little girl felt so comfortable with all of them. We only had a few minutes, she said. We couldn't go to a sit-down restaurant, but we went to that fast-casual shrimp taco stand, and we ate as we walked along the pier. They've got it mostly cleaned up now, and it was nice.
Sounds casual,
Robin said.
Easy.
It was casual and easy, Kelli said, nodding at Robin. I had a good time. He asked if he could see me again, and I said yes. My mother and Devin are taking Parker tonight. She cut a glance at AJ. If we're done here, that is. I can reschedule. You will absolutely not reschedule, AJ said, gesturing for Kelli to come closer. "I have Kristen to mother me. I'm the one who mothers you, Kel, and you will be going out with this Shad Webb man."
Shad Webb? The financial director for Five Island Cove?
Alice looked up from her phone. "Oh, I know Shad Webb," Eloise said. "He attends some of the same meetings as Aaron." She pressed in close to Alice and looked over her shoulder. "Yep, that's him."
He's gorgeous,
Alice said, her eyes still a bit too wide not to look stunned.
You didn't mention how good-looking he was.
"Let me see," AJ said, reaching for the phone. But Robin was mobile, and she beat AJ over to Alice's left side. She pressed in close, too, and Kristen could only smile at the trio as they peered at the phone. Robin said, glancing at Kelli. "He is handsome. Looks a little older than you." "He's 9 years older," Kelli said, her hands twisting around each other. "Is that too old? I mean, he's 54. Parker is only 9. If we got married or anything, he'll be—"
Wait.
Robin held up both hands.
Married?
"We're not going to get married," Kelli said. "You might," AJ said.
Right,
Alice said.
"We're not dead just because we're 45.
That brought the conversation to a halt again, but this time everyone focused on Alice.
What?
She asked. "Who did you meet?" AJ demanded. "And bring me that phone so I can see this gorgeous financial director."
Alice took the 2 steps and handed AJ the phone.
She whistled and looked at Kelli. "I'm surprised you've never mentioned him." "It's been a rough few months," Kelli said, swallowing. "This can't be your thing for Wednesday's lunch," Eloise said. "You sent that text way before you got on the ferry last night." Kelli shook her head, her lips pressed together. "That's something else."
I have something for Wednesday, too,
Alice said. "So do I," Kristen said, bringing all of her girls' attention to her. The silence stretched for several long moments. "Perhaps Shad has an older brother," Robin said, a playful smile on her face. Everyone started laughing, and the tension in the room broke. "What did I miss?" Laurel asked as she entered the room. "You would not believe the traffic out there. They've got a 1-lane road on the busiest street downtown." She accepted the 6th cup of coffee from Alice and looked around. She hitched her police belt higher and took a sip from her to-go cup. "I have a gun if someone needs me to prompt them to start talking." Chapter 7. Laurel Baker grinned as the other women in the hospital room laughed. She did have a gun on her hip, but she wouldn't use it against these people. She'd let them into her life, and all of them were like sisters to her. She had a better relationship with some over others, something she was well aware of as her eyes skipped past Eloise. She did love Eloise, because Aaron did. Eloise was very good at keeping things from delving into awkward, but there wasn't the same closeness between them that Laurel felt with Alice or Robin. AJ had been fairly engrossed in her own life and relationship, and Kelli lived on Pearl Island, which Laurel literally had no reason to visit ever. She saw Kelli around town here and there, but nothing major. She worked at the junior high, so she couldn't attend the weekly lunches. Laurel herself barely attended those, though she had been to several over the past 3 months. She and her partner worked sanctuary almost exclusively, and Laurel suspected that Aaron kept her there so she could check up on his girls when they got off the ferry in the afternoons and be nearby Eloise and her mother, should either of them need help. The chief had never said as much, but Laurel knew he trusted her. Her phone buzzed, and her radio chirped as Robin started detailing the very handsome older gentleman that Kelli had gone out with last night. Laurel looked at the picture, nodding. "I know Shad. I had to escort him home because there was this guy who didn't like how the town was managing the money for the Founders' Day festival one year. He'd been sending him threats and whatnot." Shad Webb was a well-known and well-respected man around the cove. He'd worked for the town for 29 years, and Laurel had heard whisperings of retirement for a few of the positions in the city recently. "Maybe I shouldn't go out with him," Kelli said. "Nah," Laurel said. "It was years and years ago. My first year on the force." She sipped her coffee, and Alice had managed to get them to put the exact right amount of caramel in it. She didn't know how she did that, though Laurel had asked her how she ordered it and done exactly the same. Whenever she ordered, the coffee was still far too sweet. This still had notes of bitterness, and Laurel drank greedily again. She hadn't eaten breakfast, but that was nothing new. Paul teased her that she shouldn't skip the most important meal of the day, but Laurel couldn't eat the toast and eggs her boyfriend did in the morning. He'd started to hint that if she'd stay over at his place, he'd make breakfast for her every morning, but Laurel never did. She wasn't sure she was ready for that, though she and Paul had been intimate. Every step Laurel took seemed to take a year, where most women didn't need so much time to heal. She simply didn't want to rush into anything, and it had taken her 6 months to take the step of doing anything more than kissing. She wasn't embarrassed about it, and she told Paul all of the things she was thinking and feeling. He was kind and attentive, and Laurel had started to fall in love with him. Even now, just thinking about him serving her breakfast, her stomach fluttered. "No, I meant maybe I shouldn't go out with him if he's so well known," Kelli said. "What do you know about him? Why has he been single for so long?" Laurel lowered her nearly empty coffee cup and blinked at Kelli. "I'm not sure," she said haltingly. Even if she did, she wouldn't say. Kelli should get to know Shad, and he should get to tell her private details like that. "You'll go out with him," Robin said, stepping over to Kelli and putting her arm around her, "and you'll ask him all of those things." She smiled at Kelli as if she were Kelli's mother and they weren't the same age. "Right, girls?" "Right," they chorused together. And in moments like that, Laurel was reminded that she was the odd man out. Odd woman out. She hadn't grown up with these women, and she hadn't been in the same seafaring girls' troupe they'd all been in. She knew Robin Grover because the woman was practically an icon for the quintessential resident of Five Island Cove. She ran in the morning. She did volunteer work around town. She threw great events for her clients. She'd been nothing but kind and inclusive to Laurel, and they'd actually run together a couple of times. But Laurel's schedule was sporadic and hard to predict, and she hadn't been down to the beach in her running shoes for a while. Laurel remembered her phone had chimed, and she checked it to find Paul had messaged. She knew Alice was sidling up to her, but it was okay, because Alice knew all about the misgivings Laurel had about her relationship with Paul. Alice and Laurel had grabbed coffee several times over the past few months, and Laurel sure did like the woman. She was articulate and smart, and she didn't take crap from anyone, male or female.
"What does Paul need?"
Alice asked, her voice almost a murmur. The conversation carried on around them, and Kristen took the recliner Alice had vacated when Laurel had arrived. "He's off tomorrow," Laurel said. "He wants to take his sailboat out."
"That sounds fun,"
Alice said. Laurel snorted and started tapping on her phone. "I think it's more like a death wish. Look at this thing." She swiped open her gallery and tapped on the picture of Paul's sailboat. Alice looked at the picture, a gasp going in on her next breath. "Does that float?" "He claims it does. Says she has character." Laurel looked at the Daisy May, the name of Paul's beloved sailboat. She hadn't even known he owned a sailboat until last week. "Every 7 weeks, our schedules line up and we have the same day off. I'm supposed to pick up whatever food I want for the day, and I'm trying to think of what I want for my last meal." Alice laughed with her, and Laurel quickly navigated back to Paul's text. He'd asked her if she'd heard anything about AJ yet. And then he'd asked if she could please bring some grape soda on their outing tomorrow. She gave her report of AJ, confirmed on the grape soda, and had barely finished sending her text when the door opened again. She didn't think there'd be room for another body, and she prepared to step out when she actually got stopped short.
"All right," the man said, looking up from his tablet. "Ava Jane, you're cleared for—"
"Dr. Carmen?" Laurel blurted out, though she knew it was him. She'd know that blue-eyed face and that lilting walk anywhere. She started to laugh as he turned toward her, surprise in his eyes.
"Laurel,"
he said, grinning. She threw herself into his arms, forgetting for a moment about the audience they had. "You look great," she said, stepping back as quickly as she'd embraced him. "I can see you've been working out."
"That I have," he said, still smiling. "You must be friends with Ava Jane here."
Laurel nodded, her eyes flickering to AJ. Because she was a cop, Laurel could take in a lot of details at once. She felt and saw all the curious looks from the other women in the room, right down to 10-year-old Grace Sherman. Dr. Carmen started to tell AJ that her doctor had cleared her for release and that he'd go start the paperwork.
"About an hour,"
he said, patting AJ's leg.
"Just enough time to order ice cream from the cafeteria."
He flashed a blinding smile around the room, his eyes landing on Laurel's.
"Can I talk to you outside for a minute?"
"Sure," she said, glad for a reason to step out. Robin, particularly, would pounce the moment the doctor left, and by following him, Laurel bought herself a few seconds of peace. "Hurry back now," Alice said, plenty of meaning in her voice. "We need to make a few plans for keeping AJ sane over the next 3 weeks." Laurel nodded and caught the door as it started to swing closed behind Dr. Carmen.
Chapter 8. Eloise Hall darted up the steps ahead of Kristen and AJ. She wasn't sure which woman needed more help, in all honesty. Kristen seemed a bit on the pale side, and Eloise's stomach growled as she gripped the knob and twisted it. Perhaps Kristen was just hungry. AJ had said she was on the drive home from the hospital. Eloise had plenty of work to do at the Cliffside Inn, and she glanced at the huge clock above the couch in Matt Hymas's living room as she turned back to receive AJ and Kristen. "Right to the couch, AJ," she said. AJ still had over 4 months left in her pregnancy, but her belly was noticeable. With only half of it over, Eloise wanted to make sure AJ didn't lose her baby. "Yes, ma'am," AJ said as she went by. She wore a smile instead of a glare, which she'd been shooting at Robin for at least 2 hours. Robin could be overbearing, but she was the nicest person in the cove. She cared about people, really cared, and she only wanted what was best for AJ. AJ groaned as she sat on the couch. Kristen bustled about, getting a blanket for her from the back of the love seat and finding a few more pillows to help prop up AJ. "I'm going to make a quick lunch," Eloise said, hurrying into the kitchen. She had her final dress fitting in an hour, and she couldn't be late for it. She couldn't miss it, or she'd be wearing a billowing white tent to get married in. Her first wedding hadn't been anything spectacular, and the marriage had been one of the biggest regrets and mistakes of her life. She so wanted this wedding to be what everyone was saying it was, the wedding of the year. She could do without all the press and publicity, but Aaron was the chief of police. Eyes followed him and everything he touched everywhere he went. That included Billy and Grace, his daughters, and Eloise, his fiancé. "Grace, you call your dad and tell him where we are," Eloise said as the little girl came into the house last. "Then come help me with lunch."
"Okay,"
Grace said, skipping over to the dining room table and picking up Eloise's phone. She started to poke through the fridge and cupboards, looking for something easy to make for the 4 of them. "When will Matt be back?" she called into the living room. Kristen had sat on the edge of the love seat, and she had one hand on AJ's knee. "He didn't say," AJ said. "Don't worry about him."
"Daddy, we're at AJ's house,"
Grace said, and Eloise glanced past her as she pulled out a package of ground beef. She could make taco salad in the time it took to brown the beef, and she set a pan on the stovetop. AJ had lettuce, tomatoes, and cheese, but not much else in the way of toppings. No canned corn or black beans, no olives. Eloise told herself it didn't matter, and she started breaking up the beef. She kept her hands moving, and after only 15 minutes, she had salad ready to eat. She put some of everything in a bowl and took it into the living room. AJ looked up at her with such appreciation, and while Eloise had often felt a bit removed from AJ, right now she didn't. "Thank you, Elle." AJ's eyes shone with unshed tears, and Eloise's throat tightened. She swallowed and glanced toward the kitchen as noise met her ears. "Grace, wait for me," she said, hurrying back that way. "Kristen, stay there. I'll bring you some too." "Not much cheese for me, dear," Kristen said as Eloise arrived on the scene only a moment before Grace would have dumped the whole bowl of chopped lettuce on the floor. "Okay," Eloise yelled, her grip on the bowl firm. "Gracie, you should get some help before you throw everything on the floor." She gave the girl a smile, but her patience was nearly gone. "Let me hold it for you." She kept the bowl steady while Grace pinched the tongs together and added the lettuce to her plate. Eloise stayed nearby and let the girl finish putting together her salad. "Go eat at the table," she said. "I'll be right there." Eloise quickly put together 2 salads, one with a lot of cheese and one with hardly any, and took the latter to Kristen. She smiled at Eloise, her warmth so real and so infectious. At the same time, she looked utterly exhausted. So much passed between them that Eloise decided against taking up the other half of the love seat and asking Kristen what was wrong. She knew what was wrong. Kristen was tired because she hadn't been sleeping. She hadn't been sleeping because it had been almost a year since Joel had died. Kristen didn't like talking about her husband, and Eloise could admit to still having mixed feelings about the man. A quick glance at AJ told her that the pregnant woman wasn't going anywhere, and Eloise returned to Grace and her salad at the table. She ate quickly, ignoring Robin's texts for the time being. Eloise knew where she needed to be and at what time. As she started putting away the leftovers, she noticed how quiet the living room had become. She paused when she found both AJ and Kristen asleep, a smile filling her face. She did love the 2 of them, and while they didn't seem like a likely pair, Kristen was the perfect person to take care of AJ for a few days. AJ's sister and father lived on Pearl Island, and AJ had said she'd call them to let them know what had happened. Eloise suspected those phone calls hadn't been made yet, because if they had, AJ's family would be here. "Come on, Gracie," she said. "I have to meet Robin to try on my dress."
Dad said he'd be here at 1.
Grace said. "It's past that," Eloise said, pushing against her irritation. The press conference for Aaron's father should have ended hours ago. What could be keeping him? Any number of things, Eloise thought. The man was the chief of police, and the island was still in various stages of cleanup from the tsunami. They held a huge spring bazaar every year, too, and Aaron had been hiring temporary cops for weeks now. She paused in the living room, wondering if she should wake Kristen to tell her she had to leave. She decided against it and quietly led Grace out onto the porch. 2 cars pulled into the driveway, one right after the other, staying over on the right so she could get out on the left.
"Dad!"
Grace called as she let go of Eloise's hand and ran down the steps. The girls missed their father when he worked, and the man worked a lot. He'd done the best he could, just like most people did, and Eloise smiled as he scooped Grace up into his arms, both of them laughing. The girl certainly wasn't sick enough to stay home from school, but she'd done something that morning to convince Aaron she was. "Hey, sweetheart," Aaron said easily, setting Grace on her feet. "Sorry I'm a minute late." "It's okay," Eloise said. "I was just headed out." She put one hand against his chest to steady herself as she kissed him.
Is AJ inside?
Matt asked, interrupting them. Yep, Eloise said. She's asleep, and there's taco salad for lunch. Kristen Shields is here with her, so you can still go to work and stuff. She gave him a smile, and she could see why a woman like AJ would like a man like Matt. He was tall, too, athletic, with plenty of bulk in his shoulders and chest. He looked his age, much the way Aaron did, and the concern radiating from him was obvious.
Thank you, Eloise,
he said, turning immediately toward the house. He took the steps 2 at a time, but opened the door gently.
You're coming with me, little miss,
Aaron said, and Eloise turned her attention back to the pair of them. Their eyes met, and Aaron swept his arm around her waist, his smile wide.
Are you going out to the inn after the fitting?
I don't think so, she said. I'm tired after this morning. Eloise leaned into his strength. I think AJ will be okay, but she's not one to sit around on the couch.
Come to my place when you're done,
he said, sobering.
I'll take care of you this afternoon.
Eloise smiled at him and leaned forward to press her forehead to his, letting her eyes drift closed. You will, huh? The chief doesn't have to work this afternoon? Her voice barely came out in a whisper, making the moment private and intimate.
The chief has plenty to do this afternoon, but he's not going to do it,
he whispered back. Eloise kept her eyes closed.
27 days,
Aaron said, touching his lips to her cheek.
You sure we have to keep waiting?
Yes, Eloise said, pressing into his next kiss that landed almost on her neck. It's the wedding of the year, Aaron. We can't just move it up because you're getting impatient. When he matched his mouth to hers, she felt the smile. He kissed her like he couldn't wait to make her his wife, and Eloise had always felt that level of care from him. She hoped such a thing wouldn't fade once they said I do, and she hoped she could kiss him back with as much tenderness and love as he gave her. I love you, Aaron, she said, breaking the kiss when she remembered they stood in Matt's front driveway with Grace standing nearby. Be safe this afternoon.
Have fun at the fitting,
he said.
Send me pictures.
Nope. Eloise grinned at him as he stepped back.
Love you, Elle.
He reached for Grace and took her hand, leading her over to his cruiser. Eloise waved to the girl and then got behind the wheel of her car. She'd ferried over in it this morning, and that had taken a few extra minutes, so she'd been one of the last to arrive at the hospital. She made the quick drive to the bridal shop, and she got out of the car when she saw Robin walking inside, her phone pressed to her ear. Eloise paused and watched her best friend, the sound of her intense voice floating back to Eloise's ears. Poor Robin had taken on so much in the past few months. If Eloise ever needed an example of what hard work and determination looked like, she never needed to look farther than Robin Grover. She drew in a deep breath, hoping the dress would fit well today. She wanted to spend a few hours with Aaron, and she wanted Robin to be able to get to her next task with another bride who needed the attention. She pulled open the door and went inside, still praying for her dress-fitting miracle. The dress fit amazing, Eloise said, reaching for the butter. Alice nudged it a little closer to her, and Eloise took what she wanted for her bread. She loved the brown bread here at Casper's, and she was thrilled they'd taken their lunch a little farther away from the downtown area of Five Island Cove. It wasn't quite summer yet, but the tourists had already started to arrive. The downtown area was so crowded already, and Eloise felt like she'd aged a decade in the past year. She simply had little tolerance for long lines and overpriced food that was served cold after a wait. Casper's had been in the cove for about a decade, and they sat on the northern side of Diamond Island, a bit removed from the area flooded with hotels, resorts, and shops. People had to take a car to get there, and therefore more locals ate there than tourists. Really amazing, Robin said, lifting her drink to her lips.
like a glove.
Well, there was that bit that pooched out a little, Eloise said. She took a bite of her bread.
They're going to fix that zipper, Robin said. Other than that, she's nearly ready.
Eloise didn't feel super ready for the wedding, but she trusted Robin, and she knew all the details would be taken care of. She had the dress. Aaron had his tux. They had a venue on the waterfront, and all of the invitations had been sent. Laurel set down her menu.
I can't believe I haven't been here before.
I'm glad we came here then,
Alice said, reaching for Robin's phone. She'd pulled up a picture of Eloise in her dress, and the phone was making its way around the table. She gave Laurel a smile, and Eloise watched the other woman bask in the warmth of it. Eloise liked Laurel Baker just fine, though she suspected that the cop thought she didn't. She needed to do something about that, and the thought that she should ask Laurel to do something just the two of them entered her mind again. She had Laurel's number, and perhaps they could go to a movie together, or grab coffee, or just get a couple of frozen drinks and sit on the beach for a few minutes. Eloise didn't know what she needed to say to Laurel to get things where they should be, but she knew if she put forth the effort, the words would come. She'd seen the progress with her mother, and Eloise had gotten past some of her silence. The chatter continued around her, but Eloise pulled out her phone and sent a quick text to Laurel. The other woman sat only a few feet away, on the other side of the table.
Sorry I'm late,
Kelli said, rushing into the chair next to Eloise. We're just eating bread, Eloise said, smiling at her and tucking her phone away again. She refused to look down the table to Laurel to see her reaction to the message. Did you get your issues sorted at the school?
Yes,
Kelli said, smiling. She put one arm around Eloise's shoulder.
How was the dress?
Robin's got a photo, Eloise said, as Alice handed over the phone.
Is it just us?
Robin asked.
I'm going to call AJ,
Kelli said, peering down at the phone.
She and Kristen still want to participate.
Let's get our orders in then,
Alice said,
and then we'll call them.
This dress is stunning,
Kelli said, looking up at Eloise.
Are you excited?
You know what? I think I'm finally excited.
Oh, you've been excited the whole time,
Robin said, scoffing.
It's just getting closer, that's all. I see this in brides all the time.
Alice met Eloise's eyes, and that was a big mistake. They both started laughing at the same time, with Kelli and Laurel only a moment behind.
She sees this in brides all the time,
Alice said, nudging Robin with her elbow.
What?
Robin asked.
I do.
Okay, let's order, Eloise said, because she could see this conversation devolving quickly.
I'll call AJ,
Kelli said.
Then we can get to the news. Chapter 9. Kelli propped her phone against the salt and pepper shakers and said, That's as good as it's going to get, AJ. It's fine, AJ said. I can hear. Kristen's right here with me.
I'll bring you the shrimp ravioli,
Eloise said, and Kelli's patience started to stretch thin. She wasn't sure why she was so irritated already. She hardly ever got to lunch with her friends, and she'd been fighting jealousy for months because of it. Now that she was here, she felt harried and like she had so many other things she needed to get done today.
All right,
Alice said, her eyes landing on Kelli.
Who wants to go first?
I'm claiming last, Kelli said. She wasn't sure if that was a good idea or a huge mistake. If she went first, everything would just be out. If she went last, she could judge if her news was big or not.
I was going to go last,
Alice said.
I should have led with that I'd like to go last.
Kelli called it, Robin said, giving Alice a slight glare. I'll go first, because my news isn't that surprising. Duke is for sure going to Alaska again this summer. I hope I don't go insane with the amount of weddings I have. She gave an exaggerated sigh, and Eloise assured her she could always come to the inn to work. Robin looked at Alice, as if she'd go next. Alice nearly choked on her sip of water, and she coughed as she cleared her throat.
Okay, I'm next. Oh, wow. I don't even know if I can say it.
That bad? Laurel asked.
Not bad,
Alice said.
I'm just nervous about it.
Spit it out, AJ said, her voice tinny through the phone.
A man asked me to dinner, and I walked away because Robin was calling about AJ.
She took a deep breath.
I called him back and said I'd like to go.
Who is it? Eloise asked, reaching for another bite of bread.
Arthur Rice,
Alice said. Robin yelped, then shrieked, but Kelli had no idea who Arthur Rice was.
You have got to be kidding,
Robin said, reaching for her napkin.
What are your kids going to say?
Who's Arthur Rice? Eloise asked. He's a counselor at the high school, Laurel said. Kelli's eyes flew back to Alice, who gave a single nod.
He's 50, and he's handsome, and yes, he's Charlie and Ginny's counselor. He asked me out right there in his office, after calling me in to tell me Charlie was the smartest kid in the school in chemistry.
Kelli had no idea what to say. Alice looked uncomfortable, and that was saying something for Alice. She usually led out with supreme confidence in everything she did. There was no hemming and hawing for Alice Kelton. She had goals and agendas, and she always knew the right step to take.
Charlie?
Robin asked.
That's great, Alice. Good for him.
She smiled and reached over to give her a side hug. And you got a date, Eloise said. When are you going out with him?
Friday.
Alice nodded like that was that, and that was more the persona Kelli expected from her.
All right, Laurel,
Alice said with a sigh.
Time for you to take the spotlight off me.
Laurel set her soda glass down. Mine's sort of a question. You don't have to answer today or anything. She cleared her throat, and Kelli shot a glance at Eloise. There was something between the two of them, but Kelli didn't know what it was. She often felt like the one on the outside of things, and she'd had to come to terms with that. Sometimes it was easier than others. How do you know when you're in love? Silence descended on the table, and that was something very few people could do. Kelli had no answer for that because she didn't know either. My goodness, Robin said, always one to cover over awkward silences. Do I need to clear a spot on my schedule for you and Paul? She wore a look of delight, and Laurel smiled as she shrugged. She was a beautiful woman, with lots of dark hair and a curvy figure that looked good even in her police officer uniform. She had some trauma in her past, and Kelli knew some of what Laurel had been through. She herself often felt so desperate for someone to love her, and she felt like she had the same question as Laurel. She'd enjoyed spending time with Shad, and he'd brought pizza to her house last night. Parker's favorite kind had kept him happy, and when he'd gone outside to ride his bike with a couple of boys who lived in the twin home down the street, Kelli had stood on the shared front patio with Shad. He'd slipped his hand into hers, and Kelli's fingers still tingled with the anticipation and heat of a male touch that possessed energy and hope. A male touch that wasn't just for the man, but for her too. I just feel like we're moving really slow, Laurel said. I think maybe I'm in love with him, and I just don't know it. You should come have coffee with me and AJ, Kristen said over the phone. We were just talking about this today. Yep, AJ said. Come over next time you're off in the morning, Laurel. Kristen has lots of good insight. Kelli would like to hear it, but she could stop by the lighthouse any time she wanted. Jean would take Parker down to the Sea Lion Beach, and Kelli could go get Kristen's insight then.
All right, Eloise,
Alice said.
Don't worry, Laurel. I'll be thinking about your question.
Yeah, you'll probably text me in the middle of the night when you can't sleep. Laurel grinned at Alice, who returned the gesture. They certainly seemed like they got along well, and Kelli wasn't sure why her annoyance and jealousy reared. Alice was allowed to have other friends, and Laurel was such a nice person.
I don't really have anything,
Eloise said.
Can I pass?
She looked at Kelli, but she picked up the phone instead. All right, AJ, Kelli said. Or Kristen. I'll go, AJ said, and Kelli faced her toward the rest of the women at the table. The air conditioning blew in here, which really wasn't needed. Kelli suppressed her shiver, knowing it wasn't all to do with the air temperature. Matt called his parents and told them I'm pregnant. He told his children about us, and they're all coming to the wedding.
That's great news,
Alice said. Good for him, Laurel added, only reminding Kelli of how nice she was. Kelli honestly didn't know how AJ had lived with being a secret, but there were a lot of things about AJ which Kelli didn't understand. She was her best friend in the whole wide world, and Kelli was glad Matt had finally come to his senses and brought her out of the shadows. AJ didn't survive very long there, and Kelli had seen her withering these past couple of months. Kristen's up, AJ said once the congratulations finished. I'm thinking about moving, Kristen said, and another wave of silence engulfed the table. Kelli couldn't believe it either, and her idea of showing up at the lighthouse with Parker and entering Kristen's little cottage up on the bluff vanished into thin air. Where are you going to go? Robin demanded, actually taking the phone from Kelli. You're not leaving the cove, are you? Relax, Robin, Kristen said kindly. Just right here on Diamond somewhere. Somewhere where I have more grass and less rock, less wind, less... Joel. She whispered the last word, and Kelli's heart immediately squished into a smaller box.
Wow, Kristen,
Alice said.
That's a big move.
She said just right here on Diamond,
Eloise said, but Kelli knew it was way more than just the physical move. I'm just thinking about it, Kristen said. I'm looking at some 55-plus communities. There are a couple of them that haven't started being built yet, and I put my name and email address on the information list. That's all. When Kristen said, that's all, that really was all she was going to say. Kelli realized in that moment that it was her turn to share. Her mouth felt like she'd stuffed it full of paper towels and then tried to speak. You're up, Kel, AJ said, and Robin still held the phone, this time facing Kelli. AJ knew this news already, and Kelli seized onto that fact. She drew in a deep breath and blew it out. I own my childhood home on Belle Island, she said. I bought the house on Seabreeze Shore. Robin looked like she'd been struck by a brick. Alice gaped at her. Laurel didn't seem all that confused, but Eloise blinked rapidly. The one with the stained glass windows? Yes, Kelli said. My father made those windows. You don't even like your father, Robin said. I've owned it for a while, Kelli said, ignoring her. I own the glassworks, too. I own it all. She didn't need to explain how she'd gotten the glassworks, as they all knew that story. She couldn't explain what the house and her father's old glass-blowing shop meant to her. The nostalgia and the thought of someone else using them just couldn't be adequately put into words. She felt the same way about the house and the glassworks as she did about love. She couldn't define them, but she knew she wanted them. Wow, Kelli, Eloise said. I knew about the glassworks, obviously, but the house, too.
I think it's great,
Alice said, smiling at Kelli.
Good for you, Kelli. Are you and Parker going to live in the house?
Yes, eventually, Kelli said, scanning the table again. I'd love some help if anyone has a few spare hours on the weekends. That's when I go. I can help, Eloise said instantly. Just tell me what you need me to do, and I'll do my best to figure it out. Yes, Robin said. Duke has some tools.
Aaron has a lot of power tools, too.
Eloise said.
I can come on Saturday,
Alice said. Yes, Kelli said, smiling at her. Then I can hear all about the hot date. Alice laughed, and Kelli did too. That broke the shock and silence at the table, and thankfully, their meals arrived a moment later. A few minutes passed while everyone got situated, and Kelli disconnected the video call with Kristen and AJ. She then met Eloise's eyes, and a quiet understanding passed between them. Kelli put her hand on Eloise's knee under the table, a silent thank you for volunteering to come help with the house on Seabreeze Shore. Chapter 10. I'm sure you want to know about Dr. Carmen, Laurel said, watching Alice place a plate of peanut butter chocolate chip cookies on the edge of the desk. Laurel's favorite, and Alice knew that. I mean, I know you don't bake for just any reason. Alice trilled out a laugh that made Laurel smile. She leaned forward and picked up 2 cookies, as she'd run 4 miles with Robin that morning. Laurel found that if she wanted to be friends with people, she had to make an effort to spend time with them. Eloise's text flashed through her mind, and Laurel still didn't know what to do about it.
Actually,
Alice said, forgoing the cookies and reaching for a sugarless mint instead.
I want to hear about you and Paul.
There was him, too, but Laurel didn't know what to say about him. Dr. Carmen was the doctor who took care of me when I came into the hospital when I finally got brave enough to leave my abusive ex. The words flowed from Laurel easily, and she wondered if that meant she'd taken another step forward in her healing. He was kind, he listened, he got all the right people there to help. Laurel took a bite of her first cookie and cocked her head to the side, the rest of the explanation unspoken.
I didn't think anything of you and Dr. Carmen,
Alice said.
Sure you did,
Laurel said around her mouthful of cookie. She finished chewing and swallowed. I have eyes, Alice. Everyone did, especially Eloise. Alice's lawyer eyes sharpened, and she placed both hands on the desk in front of her, her elbows also touching the tabletop.
What does that mean?
Laurel took another bite of her cookie. She didn't know what to say. Alice and Eloise were very close. Laurel knew that. Out of all of them, Alice seemed to be the one they all came to. Perhaps Robin. No. They flocked to Eloise. Or Kristen. As Laurel warred with herself, she realized that the 6 of them were so intertwined it was impossible to find a crack or weakness among them. She took her phone out of her pocket, jostling her police tools to do it. Her waist sometimes ached in the evenings after a long day of carrying radios, handcuffs, weapons, and more. She needed a massage, something terrible, and a brand new idea burst into her head. Tell me what Eloise means, she said, sliding the phone across Alice's desk. The other woman caught the phone, then cocked one eyebrow at Laurel.
Eloise?
Just read it. Alice picked up the device and tapped a few times. Laurel finished her cookie. Eloise's message burned into her retinas. I would love to get to know you better. Perhaps we could go to a movie or get lunch, just the 2 of us. She'd added a smiley face to the end of the message, but Laurel had been confused from the very first word.
She wants to get to know you better,
Alice said.
I've noticed you 2 aren't as chatty and friendly as you are with the rest of us.
She handed the phone back, and Laurel frowned at it. She thinks Aaron was cheating on her with me, Laurel said. Alice opened her mouth, stopped, and shut it. She didn't tell you.
She hasn't mentioned that.
It's not true, Laurel said. Everything blew up months ago. She's nice enough that she lets me come around with you guys. Misery streamed through Laurel. She really liked these women, and she didn't want any fences between them. I was thinking I should suggest a massage. she said, watching Alice for a reaction. Heaven knows I need one desperately, and Eloise said she has a new masseuse at the inn. Would she like that? She could have asked Aaron, too, but Laurel had kept everything straight-laced and professional between them since the blow-up in the grocery store parking lot. That night, she'd taken a huge leap forward in her relationship with Paul, and she supposed she should thank Aaron and Eloise for that.
I think she'd love that, Alice said. That's a great idea.
Laurel nodded and started tapping. She's probably going nuts that I've not answered for over a day. She quickly sent the message and looked at Alice again. I just don't want to mess anything up with her.
You won't, Alice said. Laurel, you're a great person. I hate that someone did something to tell you otherwise.
She reached for a cookie, and they both took a bite of theirs.
Also, here's a tip with Eloise.
Alice smiled and brushed crumbs from her fingers.
Give her the space to talk. She has something to say, but she won't say it if there's too much other chatter.
Okay, Laurel said. She was a master of awkward silences, and she could give Eloise the space she needed. Her phone buzzed, and she smiled at the text. A massage is perfect, she read from the phone. Let me check the schedule here at the inn, and we'll see if we can make something work with everything else we have going on.
That's going to be the tricky part, Alice said. She's getting married in 3 weeks.
It's almost the summer season, Laurel said. The first one for Cliffside.
And you work the weirdest hours.
Alice smiled at Laurel, and she was so glad she'd dropped by.
How was the sailing earlier this week?
I didn't die, Laurel said with a grin. Boat didn't sink. Surprisingly. She'd had a great time with Paul, because Laurel loved being with Paul. She loved his laugh and the way he took care of her. She loved the shape of his mouth against hers and the way he looked in a pair of swimming trunks. She loved the way his mind worked and the way he took time to get his thoughts lined up before he spoke. I think I'm in love with him, she whispered. But before Alice could say anything, the front door burst open. Mom! Charlie yelled, and he didn't sound happy. As Alice's office sat right off the front of the house, the angry teenager appeared in the doorway only a moment later. He wore fury on his face, and it came storming off of him in such a way that Laurel stood automatically, tensed and ready for a fight. What in the world were you thinking? He demanded. Academic Olympiad? I'm not doing that. It's for losers and geeks. His chest heaved, and he waved a paper. She said, all I have to do is have you sign this, and I'm good. All ready to meet with them after school on Mondays and Wednesdays. Laurel had never heard the level of sarcasm Charlie used in his voice. Alice came to stand next to her, and she glanced at her friend. I was going to talk to you about it, Alice said. Don't worry, Mom, Ginny said as she entered the house too. She closed the door behind her, disappearing for a moment to do it. Soraya Page talked to him, and you should have seen him turn red. She giggled like this was something funny, but Laurel still had her hand on her weapon. Shut up, Charlie growled, glaring with the force of gravity as his twin walked down the hall and into the kitchen. I should go, Laurel said when Charlie looked back at Alice. You're okay here? I'm the one who's not okay, Charlie said, deflating right before their eyes. He tossed the paper to the ground, but it just floated lazily for a few seconds, finally hitting the floor. Academic Olympiad? He sounded like he couldn't believe his mother would sell his soul to the devil or that she'd done something equally as horrible. Take the cookies, Alice murmured. Wait, I might need them for Charlie. She picked up the plate, gave Laurel a quick hug, and walked her to the door. You've got this, Laurel said to her as she left, and as she walked away from Alice's house, she sent up a silent prayer for her.
Chapter 11. He said you scored the highest out of the whole school, Alice said, standing very still in the kitchen. The cookies hadn't worked. Charlie had just said she'd made them for Laurel, which was true. Alice could make about 5 things, and cookies was probably the top item she could do. "They need you." She tried next. Charlie just glared at her on his next turn. He paced in the small space between the kitchen and the living room, where Alice had put a small dining room table. She'd seen Frank pace like this many times. Her ex-husband manifested himself in Charlie from time to time. And since Charlie had grown out his hair slightly, he looked less like his father. As time went on, though, and he became more of a man with every passing day, the more he reminded Alice of Frank. He was extremely good-looking, and Alice knew about all the girls that called, texted, and put notes in his locker. Ginny had said they'd even found a package of Oreos, Charlie's favorite cookie, and a note in the car one day after school. Charlie had been loyal to Mandy Grover, Robin's daughter, and Alice had talked herself blue in the face about sexting, sending and getting nude pictures, and other things she'd never thought she'd need to discuss. Thankfully, she'd included Ginny in the conversation, because life for teens wasn't the same as when Alice had grown up. Ginny was a beautiful girl, and she'd been asked on several dates recently. Prom sat right around the corner, and Ginny had had a date for a month now. They were going to pick up the dress tomorrow. She thought of Arthur, and she swallowed. Today's conversation wasn't anywhere near over.
"I'm not doing it,"
Charlie growled.
"I don't care if they need me. I don't owe them anything."
"Soraya is cute," Ginny said, re-entering the conversation at the worst time possible. "Why aren't you at work?" Alice asked the pair of them. "He was spitting mad, Mom," Ginny said. "You should have seen him. It was like he was a volcano about to explode. Poor Soraya." She shook her head.
"Poor Soraya?"
Charlie asked, finally pausing long enough to look at his sister. He pushed his dark hair off his forehead.
"What does that mean? I was nice to her."
"You were not," Ginny said, looking at him with wide eyes. "She stopped you in the hall and you were sort of short with her, said you had to get to work."
"I did,"
he said.
"We did."
"So she mentioned the academic Olympiad thing and you were like, 'This is why you stopped me?'" Ginny looked from Charlie to Alice and back to her brother. "You legit rolled your eyes." She looked at me, concerned, and I said something like, "Don't worry, he's usually pretty nice." Then she said something about the Sadie's beach party and if you wanted to go with her. You got all red in the face, growled something about never doing the stupid academic Olympiad because it's for losers, and stomped away. I had to apologize for you and run to catch up with you." Ginny looked at Alice, who didn't know what to think. Of course, Charlie would think other girls were pretty. He'd like other girls. Still, her heart beat strangely in her chest because she did not want him to hurt Robin's daughter. "He would have left me, Mom. He wasn't even thinking clearly." "And you drove home in this angry state?" Alice demanded, folding her arms. "He let me drive," Ginny said quickly, swallowing as she looked at her brother. "You're lying," Alice said. She used to let such things slide, but no more. "Charlie drove home, and you're covering for him because we've talked about making sure you're safe to drive." "Fine," Ginny bit out. "He drove home. He was beyond reason, just like he is now." She jumped to her feet. "And he made me miss my shift at the ice cream shop. You owe me $50, Einstein." She swatted his chest, and he had the decency to flinch away from her, an apologetic look on his face. She stormed out of the main rooms of the house, leaving Alice with Charlie. Alice's mind screamed at her to get Ginny back in there. She needed to tell the twins about her date with their school counselor, and she wasn't going to do it twice. Instead, she looked at Charlie, all of her maternal instincts firing. Do you want to tell me what happened?
Do you want to tell me why you're going out with my counselor and haven't told me?
Charlie's shoulders raised, and all that furious fire returned to his eyes. Alice swallowed, because no, she didn't want to detail that. She studied the plate of peanut butter cookies. Mr. Rice called me into his office this week.
That doesn't mean you leave with a date, Mom.
I went to see him, Alice said, ignoring the ice in her son's tone, because he said he had something to discuss with me about you. It was your perfect score on the organic chemistry test. He was quite proud of you, and he gave me the same permission form you left on the floor in my office. She sighed and rounded the counter. She pulled out the chair at the head of the table and sank into it. Pushing both hands through her hair, she said, I didn't know how to bring it up with you. I didn't think you'd be interested, but he said he'd have the captain talk to you. Then he asked me to dinner. Alice looked up at Charlie. Robin was calling, so I ran away without answering him, but I did like him, Charlie, okay? She tapped the table at the seat next to her. Come sit down. He'd stopped pacing, and Charlie was far more mature than Alice had given him credit for. Did he tell you? Charlie took the seat, looking more and more miserable by the moment.
He pulled me out of fifth period. I thought I was in trouble.
Alice smiled at him, and she'd take her assumptions about the same thing to the grave. What did he say?
He asked if I'd given any thought to the academic Olympiad. I told him I didn't know what he was talking about. He seemed confused, and he said he'd talk to Soraya and then you, tonight, on your date.
He switched his eyes from the table to hers, glaring at her.
The bell rang and off you went, leaving me there like a fish with my mouth open. So then I was late, trying to go the wrong way back into the classroom to get my crap, and then stupid Soraya Page stopped me in the hall.
She's not stupid, Alice said automatically. Charlie. Ginny made it sound like she asked you to the beach party. Charlie sighed and reached up and pushed his hand through his hair again.
I think she did. She said something about it and then asked if I wanted to go with her.
Do you? Charlie's face grew pink again, turning red right up by his eyes.
I mean, she's really pretty. She's super smart. Oh my God. I called her a loser.
Alice didn't smile or placate him. His eyes rounded, and he fumbled for his phone.
What should I do?
Do you have her number?
No,
he said.
Maybe I can get it from someone.
Charlie, Alice said slowly. What about Mandy? All of the franticness in his fingers and face evaporated. He met Alice's eyes, his searching hers for an answer. You like her too, right? He nodded, still silent. You can't turn into your father here, Alice said quietly. You talk to me. Tell me what you're thinking so I can help you treat these girls the right way. Charlie looked so lost for a moment, and Alice just wanted to gather him into her arms and tell him everything would be okay. She'd done that when he was a little boy and had skinned his knees. A warm washcloth, a Band-Aid, and chocolate pudding fixed him. Now, Alice had no idea what to do to help him. Are you upset about me going out with Arthur?
I mean, I guess not,
he said.
He's just some guy.
He doesn't have a daughter at the school you dislike? Alice's eyebrows went up, and Charlie opened his mouth to speak. He promptly closed it again as understanding washed across his face.
Mom,
he said.
Did you break up with Will because we don't like Tori?
He sounded stunned, aghast even. Alice couldn't vocalize the truth, so she just shrugged.
Mom,
Charlie said again.
you're kidding.
You two are more important to me than a man, she said quietly.
Ginny,
Charlie called, getting to his feet.
get back in here.
He walked to the opening of the hallway and yelled her name again before turning back to Alice.
Family meeting. I'm calling it.
What? Ginny demanded from down the hall.
Family meeting,
Charlie said, returning to his seat. He sat back down as Ginny appeared in the kitchen. Family meeting? Why? She headed for the chair on the opposite end of the table, as there were just the three of them. The fourth chair Alice had stored in the carport, because it stuck out too far in the walkway and they didn't need it. Charlie called it, Alice said, keeping her eyes down. She hated that she was here alone, doing this. At the same time, she'd been so much happier since leaving Frank. She'd been alone in the Hamptons, too. Here, now, at least she got to make her own decisions, and she didn't have to bend to anyone's will.
Mom's got a date with a new man tonight,
Charlie said.
It's Mr. Rice, our guidance counselor.
Ginny's eyes landed on Alice, the weight of them boring into the top of her forehead. Mom? It's true, Alice said. She repeated the story of how she'd met him and why, finally looking back to Charlie. So Charlie needs to decide a couple of things. First, how to apologize to Soraya Page. Second, if he's going to do the academic Olympiad or not. Third, how he feels about Mandy. What? Ginny asked. You love Mandy.
Like, love her. Isn't that what you said the other day? Shut up, Ginny,
Charlie growled. Alice's heart thumped painfully in her chest. You're a junior in high school, she said calmly. Do you think you're in love with her?
I don't know,
Charlie mumbled. Have you slept with her?
Mom,
Charlie said. Have you? Charlie turned a shade of red Alice couldn't even identify. She had nothing to say either because she could not fathom a conversation with Robin about this.
We've talked about it,
he admitted.
We haven't done it.
Dear Lord, Alice said, pressing one hand to her heart. She knew teenagers had sex. She simply didn't want to think about her teenagers doing that. Have you told her you love her? He shook his head, his teeth pressing together to make his jaw jut out. You have a lot of other girls interested in you, Alice said, glancing at Ginny. Maybe, I don't know, maybe you should take some time to see if you like one of them more than Mandy.
You think she was just convenient for me?
Charlie said.
Because she was around when we first moved here.
I didn't say anything like that, Alice said. Nor do I think that. The thought had occurred to her, but Charlie and Mandy got along so well. If they hadn't, he wouldn't have perpetuated the relationship past the beginning of the school year, months ago. Arthur Rice, Ginny said, looking at her phone. He is handsome, Mom.
She broke up with Will because of us,
Charlie said. What? Ginny asked, gasping. Mom, that can't be true. You said he wasn't what you wanted. She looked frantically at Charlie. That's what she said.
Mom's a liar sometimes, too,
Charlie said with a smile. Alice couldn't help the grin that popped onto her face. She even laughed lightly. You two didn't like Tori. How am I supposed to make a family out of that? She shook her head, because there was more than just how the twins felt about another student. Will's a great guy. I liked kissing him, about like I did in high school. He's really rich, Ginny said. There was that too, Alice said. But honey, I married a rich man once, and it was a horrible thing. She shook her head. I didn't like how Tori dictated everything. She wants to move to Hawaii. Okay, great. She doesn't like it there. Sure, come home. She shook her head again. I want a man who's more of a man than that. So no, he wasn't what I wanted.
We still had something to do with it,
Charlie said. A little, Alice said. But that's life, guys. Everyone has a little bit of influence on you and what you decide to do. I hope I'm right there next time Charlie thinks about sleeping with his girlfriend, especially when another girl has just asked him to a Sadie's beach party, and he actually thinks he might want to go with her.
I never said I wanted to go with her.
But you do, Alice and Ginny said at the same time. Charlie rolled his eyes.
I'm so glad I have you two to tell me how I feel and what I think.
He got to his feet.
The family meeting is over.
Wait, Alice said. Are you two okay with me going out with Arthur? He's coming to pick me up at 6:30. You can meet him.
I met him in the hallway today,
Charlie said over his shoulder.
I'm good. I also have to go to work. I said I'd be late, not that I wasn't coming at all.
Okay, Alice said, hastening to follow him. She caught him right at the front door, pressing her palm against it so he couldn't walk out yet. Will you hug me, please? He turned into her and hugged her, and Alice gripped him with as much strength as she could muster. I love you, Charlie, she whispered. You are such a beautiful boy. You're becoming an amazing man, and I'm doing my best to help you get there.
I know that, Mom,
he whispered back.
I love you too.
He squeezed her extra tight, released her, and opened the front door.
Be home by 6:30.
Alice watched him walk down the few steps to the front sidewalk and head to the car he and Ginny shared. Sighing, she closed the door and turned to find Ginny standing on the cusp of the great room at the back of the house, watching her. Your dress will be ready Saturday at 11, Alice said, smiling at her. She approached her and drew her into a hug, too. I love you, Ginny. Thank you for being my friend and my daughter. Thanks for helping with Charlie. She pulled away and brushed Ginny's hair off her forehead. He wants to apologize to Soraya for calling her a loser. Could you get her number for him?
Okay,
Ginny said.
Why was he so gruff at school?
He just found out I was going out with Arthur tonight, Alice said, retracing her steps to the office, where she bent to pick up the permission form for the academic Olympiad. Soraya stopped him only a few minutes later, and he was in a rush and already upset. Ginny nodded, her eyes round.
He's scary like Dad when he's mad.
I know. Alice gave her a small smile. Next time, try to get him to let you drive. I'll tell him again that he can't drive when he's upset like that.
I didn't mean to lie.
You love him, Alice said, passing her. You two are very protective of each other.
He really does have a lot of girls who like him,
Ginny said, taking a seat at the counter and reaching for a cookie.
I have a few talk to me about him every single week.
Alice didn't know what to do with that information. She hung the permission form on the fridge with a magnet and sighed as she faced Ginny.
Soraya is super pretty,
Ginny said, munching away happily now.
They'd look so good together, and I know he likes her.
How do they know each other? Alice asked, picking up a cookie she hoped she could finish.
She's in his history class, Ginny said. They've been in the same one all year.
She must know he's dating Mandy.
I guess.
Ginny shrugged and finished her afternoon snack.
I'm still going to make him pay me for my shift.
I got it, Alice said, pulling open the silverware drawer. She lifted out the utensil organizer and plucked 3 20s from the assorted bills there. There you go, sweetie.
How long has there been money in that drawer?
Ginny demanded, and Alice could only laugh. When the doorbell rang at 6:30, Alice stood in the kitchen, fully dressed, make-upped, and ready to go. Both Ginny and Charlie scrambled to their feet, and they dang near knocked one another down in their attempt to be the first one down the hall toward the front door.
Ginny,
Charlie protested when she beat him.
you said I could open the door.
You can, Ginny said. Alice stayed right where she was, marveling at how much she loved her children. She walked to the corner of the wall, staying out of sight of the front door.
Good evening,
Arthur said, his deep voice sending rumbles through Alice's chest from 20 feet away.
How are you two tonight? Good,
Charlie said.
Where are you taking my mom tonight?
It better be somewhere nice, Ginny said.
Yeah, because she can't cook,
Charlie added.
and we just eat a lot of fast food.
Arthur started to chuckle, and Alice grinned because she'd had the same reaction. Thanks a lot, Charlie, she muttered under her breath. Selling me out for not being able to cook? A lot of men wanted a woman who could, and Alice's pulse picked up the pace. She straightened her shoulders and flipped her hair over her ear. Ginny said, "She likes expensive things," and Alice nearly tripped over her own feet in her haste to interrupt this conversation. Letting them get the door for her was a huge mistake. Huge. "Hello, Arthur," she said, interjecting herself right over the top of Charlie's statement. "Thanks, you two." She joined the twins on the threshold of the house. "We need to have a little chat about how to answer a door, don't we?" She laughed, and thankfully Arthur did too. He offered her his arm, and Alice plucked her purse from the hook right beside the door. "I'll be home by 10, she said. "Wait up and I'll tell you all about it." She grinned at the twins. "Pizza money is on the counter." She hooked her hand through Arthur's and stepped onto the front porch with him. It was a tiny space, so she continued down to the sidewalk alone, taking his arm again when he joined her. "They'll watch until they can't see your car," she said in a quiet voice. "And clearly, we don't get fast food every night. Fridays are pizza. I do like expensive things, but I've sold most of them to be here with my twins and free from my ex-husband." They arrived at his SUV, where Alice finally dared to look into Arthur's dark eyes. She wanted to trace her hand down the side of his face and feel that beard. "If any of this is a deal breaker for you, you can simply drive me to a friend's house, and I'll hang out there until 10.
Absolutely not,
He said, his smile instant and his eyes twinkling with mischief and desire.
I want every minute with you from now until 10, and then I want to see you again tomorrow.
Alice ducked her head and smiled, let him open the door for her, and waved to the twins after he'd gotten behind the wheel and started to back out. Here we go, she thought. Another first date.
Chapter 12. Eloise sat at the tiny table in her tiny house, the morning light barely peeking through the windows all along the top of the wall. She loved her tiny house, and she was planning to leave it here on her mom's property once she and Aaron got married. That way, she could have somewhere to come rest during the day if she needed to. Billy and Grace liked to come here in the afternoons and raid Eloise's cupboards for snacks. She had a television mounted to the wall, and she let them watch cooking shows and the Disney Channel if she had a lot of work to do at the inn. Grace liked to come with her and help in guest rooms or check people off the list as they arrived. Billy would, but it wasn't her favorite thing to do. Eloise had been tempting her with the promise of the swimming pool, which Eloise would be opening in a couple of months. Billy said she'd come help with that, handing out towels or picking them up. Eloise suspected the teen would likely lay in the sun and try to improve her tan, and Eloise likely wouldn't say anything about it. This afternoon, though, the girls weren't riding the ferry to Sanctuary Island, where the tiny house and the inn was. Eloise already had a package of sandpaper, Aaron's sander, and his electric drill in her car. She had an appointment for a car spot on the ferry in a couple of hours, and she was meeting Kelli at the house on Seabreeze Shore on Belle Island at 10. She picked up her phone as it brightened again. Laurel had texted, "I don't work Thursdays very often, and I have the next 2 off. I'm almost always off on Sunday and every other Tuesday." She'd suggested a massage as something she and Eloise could do together. Eloise had finally been able to breathe when she'd texted yesterday afternoon, and they'd been trying to align their schedules since. "I had this Tuesday off," Laurel said, "so earliest would be Sunday, then next Thursday." "Got it," Eloise said, and she tapped to get over to the calendar for the inn. She had just hired a woman named Linda Melrose to be the on-site masseuse at the Cliffside Inn. She could really only do 4 or 5 people per day, and Eloise could bring in a second masseuse for couple sessions. "Let me check with her," she muttered to herself. She did want to spend some time with Laurel, and if they scheduled something for Sunday, Eloise wouldn't have to move too many clients. A lot of people left on Sundays, and the inn was fairly quiet, especially in the off-season. She had no idea what the summer would look like, as the inn had only been open for 3 months now. They'd been good months, though, and Eloise could pay the 2 full-time people she'd hired. With herself, the 3 of them ran the inn from check-out to check-in, housekeeping, and getting the food out every morning and evening. Rhonda Wilkinson lived on site and acted as the chef and manager whenever Eloise wasn't around. Eloise ran checkout in the mornings, checked on guests staying through the day, made sure their 5 Island Cove activities board was updated, and did various administrative tasks in a small office off the kitchen. She'd hired a woman on an hourly basis to come in and clean the rooms in the inn, and she arrived at 10 o'clock. Eloise and Rhonda helped with the housekeeping, and then Fiona stayed to do check-in until 5. Eloise stayed another hour, and by 6, Rhonda helped any other guests when they arrived, served dinner, and managed things until the next morning. Eloise had put her on a salary, and it was the best money she'd spent so far. "Could you and Mark do a couples massage on Sunday?" she sent to Linda, and the woman answered instantly with yes. Eloise started negotiating the time, then texting Laurel to work it all out. Before she knew it, her alarm went off, and she looked up in surprise. The whole reason she set alarms was to make sure she stopped whatever she was doing and moved on to the next thing. Right now, that was getting ready and getting down to the ferry for her scheduled appointment that would take her to Belle Island. Eloise sent one final text to Laurel. "Can't wait," and got up to get dressed. She really couldn't wait until their afternoon together in a couple of days, because Eloise needed to make sure everything was perfect before the wedding, and that included her friendship with Laurel. "Oh, wow," Kelli said when she came down the steps. Eloise had texted when she'd pulled into the driveway of the house, and Kelli had said she could park all the way in the carport. She'd parked, gotten out, and set the tools on the hood before Kelli appeared. "I'm not even sure I can use one of these." "Aaron showed me a video," Eloise said with a smile. "He says they're really easy, like running a vacuum cleaner, especially for what you're doing." She'd shown Aaron all of Kelli's texts, and he'd said all they needed was a sander, a specific type of sandpaper, and some stain. Kelli had picked out the color she wanted to redo the floors in the house, and she and Eloise were going to see if they could knock out the entire bottom floor. She'd already called a disposal company to come get the stain-soaked rags, as they could apparently combust if left in a trash can. Kelli didn't have services at the house right now anyway. Eloise gazed at the house, and it seemed to have weathered the years pretty well. Kelli had told her that there had been no major structural damage she needed to address, and she wasn't terribly worried about the house cosmetically either. She did want to provide a nice place for herself and Parker, and she'd been saving for the bigger furniture pieces. "Come in," Kelli said, reaching for the sander and hefting it into her arms. Eloise grabbed the box of sandpaper from the back seat and followed her. I know you guys didn't come here very often. She closed the door behind Eloise. I'm not doing much with the kitchen. If there's leftover stain, I might do the cabinets in here. Eloise took in the charming space. Kelli was right. They hadn't spent hardly any of their teenage years here. Kelli had been the shyest of the girls in the group, and her parents had gone through a divorce, and much more, just as they'd all started high school. Since AJ lived on Pearl, the two of them rode the ferry together, and AJ came here more than anyone else. You could paint them, Eloise said. They're in great shape, and Aaron says they have sprayers now to make the job easy. There weren't very many cabinets either, so the job wouldn't take long. We'll see, Kelli said, and Eloise reminded herself that Kelli didn't have a lot of money. She wasn't sure what the alimony or child support situation was, but she knew Kelli didn't work full-time at the junior high for no reason. I put all the stain in the supply closet there. She indicated a door on Eloise's right, and she opened it. Sure enough, a vacuum cleaner stood there, along with a broom, dustpan, mop, and several containers of stain. Oh, I like this color, Eloise said, turning to smile at Kelli. Let's go see what the floor looks like. She had some experience fixing up an old building, as she'd taken the cliffside inn from disaster area to functional, and she followed Kelli past the empty dining room, the stairs that led to the second floor, and into the wide-open area that took up the front of the house. I'm going to put the living room over there, Kelli said, indicating the space to the right. This is my father's old office. She spoke of the space with reverence, and Eloise marveled at that. To her knowledge, it had been Guy Watkins who'd ruined everything in Kelli's young life. He'd cheated constantly on her mother, trusted the wrong business partners, and lost his livelihood, the glassworks. With that gone, he couldn't support his family, and things had degenerated from there. Paula Watkins had divorced him. They'd lost their house. Kelli had retreated even further into herself. Even so, by their senior year, she was getting asked to attend parties and dances, while Eloise wasn't. That was so long ago, she told herself. High school didn't matter. She wasn't the same person she'd been back then, and she had the entire world in front of her now. Feeling blessed and incredibly lucky, Eloise set the sandpaper on the wide windowsill and turned to take in the office. The stained glass in here is stunning, she said, watching the sunlight glint in different shades of pink, gold, blue, and seafoam green. She turned and looked up at the beautiful windows causing all the colors, and the last name Watkins sat among the flowers and birds that had been pieced together by small pieces of colored glass. It's why I wanted the house, Kelli said. My dad's windows are in every room here. She plugged in the sander and faced the room too. Okay, so the tutorial I watched said you just need to check the boards, sand them down, and apply the stain. Sounds easy enough, Eloise said, focusing on the project at hand. I did buy a few planks in case there's one that needs to be replaced. Smart. Eloise and Kelli had been brainstorming for a couple of days about where Eloise would be put to the best use, and Kelli had decided on this floor. She also wanted all the walls down here painted, and she wanted to hang window treatments over all the windows on the second floor. Did you decide on the type of blinds you want? Eloise asked. I'm going to do the cheaper ones, Kelli said. I don't need real wood slat blinds. Eloise nodded and opened the box of sandpaper. She scanned the floor as she started toward Kelli and the sander. The wood looks really good, Kel. You probably didn't need to buy any replacement planks. Yeah, there's one over there where you were just standing, she said. My dad's desk used to be in front of that window, and you can tell where he stood, paced, or slid his chair all the time. She took the sandpaper from Eloise, but she then stepped back in the direction Eloise had just come from. AJ said to tell you thanks for the soup last night. I didn't take her soup, Eloise said, her throat narrowing. She knows you sent it from Monroe's. Kelli tossed her a smile and toed the ground. Right here, come see. Eloise moved over to stand next to Kelli. How are they doing? Really, every time I text her or Kristen, I get some fake message back about how great everything is. You can't text AJ for news, Kelli said. Not if you want the truth. If you call, she can't hide her emotions. Kelli smiled at Eloise. They're doing okay. I think Kristen is grateful she can help, and AJ hates being alone. So for right now, it's a win-win. Any other complications? Eloise couldn't even imagine having a baby or being pregnant at her age, though she had been watching AJ's pregnancy with interest. Nope, Kelli said. So of course, AJ thinks she doesn't need the full 3 weeks of bed rest. Kelli rolled her eyes and shook her head. Jean is taking Parker for me on Sunday so I can go to brunch with Shad. I'm going to stop by the house after and really see, how they're doing. Good idea, Eloise said. I can stop by other times too. I'm on Diamond almost every evening. I'm thrilled for you and Aaron, Kelli said, her voice quiet. You two seem genuinely happy together. I've loved him for a long time, Eloise admitted, her voice equally as reverent. After drawing in a deep breath, she asked, How are things with Shad? Does he treat you right? Kelli emitted a lovely sigh. He's so wonderful, she said. I keep looking for flaws, but I can't really find them. Eloise grinned at her. Good. You deserve a man who will take good care of you. Everything is just harder than I thought it would be, Kelli said. Even simple things like changing the light bulbs. I don't have anyone to hand me the new light bulb, so I'm climbing up and down the ladder, doing it all myself. I have to do everything. And I mean, I sort of did with Julian too, but I don't know. This feels different. If I don't do something, there is literally no one who will. I know, Eloise said, as she'd lived that life for many years. For me, it was a new door handle on my brownstone that broke me. She smiled a sad smile and kept looking out the window. I couldn't screw on the left side of it because the handle had to be pushed down at the same time you had to screw in. Well, there's just one of me. 2 hands. I can't hold a screw, operate a screwdriver, and hold down the handle. I felt keenly in that moment that I was so alone, and wouldn't it be so nice to have a partner there to help me? Kelli put her arms around Eloise's waist and leaned her head against Eloise's bicep. That's when I'm going to call you guys. Eloise leaned her head against Kelli's. Yes, you should. Or your new, handsome boyfriend. I'm not sure he's my boyfriend, Kelli said. We haven't kissed or anything. Held hands? Kelli straightened and nodded. Yes, a couple of times. Oh, you're smiling, Eloise teased. I know that look. It had a feeling that accompanied, and the best way to describe it was magic. Kelli inched away and toed the floor some more. I think this board is a little loose. Eloise copied her, pressing her foot against the floor. She kept testing it, not finding any boards that needed to be replaced until she came to the far corner of the room. It was the front corner, and it looked like there had been some water damage. Kel, she said, does the roof leak over here? She peered up at the ceiling, but she couldn't see any obvious signs of water damage. I don't think so, Kelli said. Eloise stomped on the floor again, and this time her foot went right through it. Oof, she said, a cry following the grunt. She went all the way to her knee, fearing she'd stomp right through the whole foundation of the house. Such a thing was silly, of course, but in the moment it took her to find solid footing, her mind panicked. So many scenarios ran through her mind, and none of them were good. Oops, she said. I broke this. I didn't mean to. You didn't break it, Kelli said, approaching from behind Eloise. It's an old house, and that plank just rotted. We'll pull it out and replace it. She put her hand in Eloise's and helped her stand. Eloise pulled her foot out of the hole she'd created, having to shimmy and shake it to get the sole of her shoe free. As she did, she heard a distinct metallic sound. She paused. Kelli had too. "Did you hear that?" Eloise asked. "I heard it." Kelli dropped to her knees and began pulling at the soft wood. It came off easily, and she piled it against the wall on her side. "Oh my goodness," she breathed, bending down. "What?" Eloise asked, squatting to get a closer look. Kelli had both hands down beneath the floor, and she'd widened the hole enough to bring up a silver metal lockbox. Flashbacks to the inn, when Eloise had found papers and folders hidden inside the walls, assaulted her. Panic filled her system, and her first thought was to get out of there, grab the lockbox and run. She was heavier than Kelli, and she likely wouldn't make it far, but perhaps she could get to the backyard and toss the box off the cliff. It would go soaring out into the ocean, and Kelli wouldn't be able to examine what was inside. Because, in Eloise's opinion and experience, nothing good could come from a hidden metal box stored beneath the floor of a house for decades. Nothing. Chapter 13. Kelli stared at the box, her mind whirring. "There's no keys here," she said, pacing away from it. Eloise had taken the box from her and gone into the kitchen. It now sat on the counter where Eloise had left it, and they'd been through everything they could think of to get it open. "I'm telling you, you don't want to see what's inside," Eloise said. She stood at the back window, staring outside, nearly lost inside her own head. She had found papers at the Cliffside Inn, and they'd revealed her father to be a gambler and to be running a gentleman's club at the inn. Her brother, likewise, had been revealed to be a dangerous man, and they'd all had something to lose at his hand. Kelli reasoned that her father's secrets had all come out already. What else could there possibly be? An image of Zach Watkins' face flashed through her mind. There could be other children, she thought. Her half-siblings, technically, as her father had slept around constantly despite being married to her mother and having 3 daughters with her. She didn't want to repeat the experience of finding out she had more people in her family than she'd known about. She didn't want to talk to her mom about that. She didn't want to open wounds that had been stitched shut. Perhaps Eloise was right. Perhaps this box should stay shut. The wind rattled the glass in the windows, breaking Eloise's concentration. She sighed and turned toward Kelli. "Let's just leave it here and get to work on the floors. You can deal with it later." "Okay," Kelli agreed. She wouldn't have access to Eloise's help forever, and her heart stung as she remembered that only Eloise had volunteered to come help her with the house. When Eloise had needed help with the inn, everyone had dropped everything and shown up. Kelli herself had hauled out enough moldy insulation to last a lifetime. Bitterness and jealousy accompanied her back to the office, where the hole in the corner mocked her. "I'm just going to call a locksmith real quick," she said, pausing to pull out her phone. "Kelli," Eloise said. "I know," she said, tapping to complete the search. "You go ahead and get started with the sander in the opposite corner. I'll get that patched up over there and come help." She turned away from Eloise because she didn't need any more free advice. It was her house, her life, and her desire to know what was in the lockbox. "Yes, hello?" she said when a woman answered. "I found my father's old lockbox, and I don't have a key. Is that something you could help me with?" 5 minutes later, she had an appointment with Ezra, who'd be there that afternoon to open the lockbox. $50, she said to Eloise, a smile coming with the words. "Let's see what we can get done before he arrives." Kelli wiped her hair back off her forehead. The sunlight, weak as it was, pouring through the front windows, making the space stifling and hot. "He's here," she said, turning her head toward the sound of knocking on the front door. Her heart started knocking against her ribcage. Her back twinged with pain as she twisted and then turned to go answer the door. She could put the $50 locksmith charge on her credit card and worry about it later. "Hello," she said as she looked at the man on the stoop. The wind rushed into the house, and the clouds shifted to conceal the sun. "You must be Ezra."
I am.
The man carried about 70 extra pounds, sported a scraggly goatee, and had yellow teeth when he smiled. Kelli was glad she wasn't there alone, but she smiled and stepped back to let him in. "It's back here in the kitchen. I can bring it out."
Whatever's easiest,
Ezra said. He wore a shirt with his name on it, all the letters inside the shape of a house key. Kelli turned and walked past the beautiful staircase that led up to the bedrooms. In the kitchen, she picked up the lockbox, feeling the weight of it. Her father had definitely put something in here and then hidden it under the floorboards. The only question in Kelli's mind was, why? Not only that, but why hadn't he told her mother about it? "Right here." She handed the lockbox to Ezra, who took it and looked at it with knowledge in his eyes that Kelli didn't have.
this is no problem,
He said, and he set the box back on the counter. He shifted his bag around to the front of his body and started pulling out tools. Only 2 minutes later, the box popped open. Relief streamed through Kelli, followed immediately by anxiety. What would she find inside the box? Eloise had warned her not to open it, and perhaps she was right. $50? Kelli asked.
Let's say 20,
He said.
That took 2 minutes, and you weren't very far out of my way.
Kelli nodded and dug into her pocket for a bill. She didn't need to put $20 on her credit card. "Thank you," she said. He wrote her a quick receipt, and she walked him to the front door. Eloise sat on the steps, her fingers flying across the screen as she texted, and Kelli said, "Thank you," again, closed the door, and leaned her back against it. Eloise looked up as a sigh hissed from Kelli's mouth, and a small smile appeared on her mouth.
Ready?
"Will you come open it with me?"
Of course.
Eloise stood, but neither of them stepped toward the kitchen. Finally, Kelli took the first step, and she reached for Eloise's hand as she passed. "I'm scared," she said. "What if I find something terrible?"
Then we'll deal with it.
Eloise said.
We've dealt with so much this year. What could possibly be in that lockbox that we can't deal with?
She gave Kelli another smile, and Kelli took some strength from it. They stopped in front of the box, and Kelli reached for it with a slightly shaking hand. She lifted the lid, her eyes searching for understanding right away. She took in the 2 stacks of money, and the breath left her body. "Oh, my word." She exhaled as she reached for the money. It was bundled with bands signaling how much was in each wrapped stack, and the top one was $2,000 worth of $20 bills. Beneath that sat another one. Then one of 50s, which was labeled with a $5,000 band. Her breath caught in her throat as she pulled out 3 of them. Her mind couldn't do the math after that, because the bottom 2 bundles of money were hundreds, bundled into $10,000 stacks. Tears filled her eyes, and she started to sob. "Has this been in the floor all these years?" She turned to Eloise, searching her face for the answer. "My mom could have kept the house with this. We wouldn't have had to move. My life could have been normal." "Oh, honey." Eloise took the money from her and dropped it back into the lockbox. She took Kelli into a hug and held her while she cried. Thankfully, Kelli had been crying a lot lately, and she could get it out quickly. She took a deep breath and released Eloise. "Thanks for being here."
Of course.
Eloise picked out all the money. She laid it all on the counter, from the largest denominations to the smallest, which was a stack of $5 bills totaling $500.
Let's add it up.
She got out her phone and started typing. After a minute or two, she said, "Kelli, look." She tilted her phone toward Kelli, who looked at the screen, not comprehending the number sitting there. 77,500. $77,000, Kelli said. She counted the bundles on the counter. 14. She could tuck them into her oversized purse and walk away from the house as if nothing had changed. So much had changed. She could buy beds for the house, a couch and love seat set, a dining room table. She wouldn't have to save every dollar she made, and she wouldn't have to wait until fall to move into the house. Is that all that's in here? Kelli started to lean forward to see what else sat in the lockbox when the lights flickered. They went out completely in the next moment, and Kelli hadn't realized there was a storm coming that was strong enough to knock out the electricity. She fumbled to get her phone out of her pocket. She flipped on the flashlight and shone it down into the box. The light glinted blindingly off the silver metal, and Kelli squinted against it. "There's a folder here." She reached for it as she held the flashlight above the box, and she pulled it out. The bottom of the box reflected the light back to her, and she quickly moved it so she didn't go blind. She set the folder on the countertop next to the bundle of fives. There's not much in it. A thin folder with only a few pages couldn't be that damaging, could it? Eloise put her arm around Kelli's waist and said, "Open it." Kelli drew in a deep breath and flipped open the folder. Once again, she found herself trying to absorb everything at once, but she was stopped short by the very top line. The last will and testament of Guy Dennis Watkins. "It's my father's will," she said. "It was never found." "Well," Eloise said in a hushed voice, "it's been found."